Before the Victorians were sending love letters, notes, or passive-aggressive complaints about jam shortages, they were living through one of the most intense communication revolutions in history, driven not by smartphones but by stamps, steam, and society's collective need to overshare in cursive. The stage was set by the Industrial Revolution, that chaotic symphony of coal smoke, factory bells, and newfangled machines designed to make things faster, even if they made people's lungs black in the process. Cities swelled, trains shrieked, jobs appeared and disappeared at whiplash speed. Suddenly, you could be born in a rural village that smelled like sheep and end up working in a smog-choked textile mill by the time you hit puberty. The world was moving faster, and people needed a way to keep up. Enter the mail. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Victorians were totally addicted to the mail, and many more. Now, leave a comment down below to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. At the same time, literacy rates were rising faster than a Victorian child's blood pressure after a sugar binge. Thanks to new laws and a growing obsession with education, and let's be honest, guilt-based Protestant work ethics, more people than ever could read and write. In 1841, only about half of England's population was literate. By the end of the century, that number had climbed above 90%, and once someone learned how to write, you can bet they were going to use that power frequently, floridly, and preferably with a wax seal and too much ink. And presiding over all this change was Queen Victoria herself, a monarch who reigned so long they basically named an entire era after her, just to save time. By the time she was done reigning, people had invented the telephone and worn enough mourning black to terrify the concept of color. Her rule was the backdrop to this great communication boom, and during her time the simple letter evolved from a luxury for the rich into the equivalent of today's voice notes, DMs, and angry reviews. The Victorian letter was not a quick, hey, what's up sort of affair. No, these were often sprawling, meticulous dispatches written with the flair of someone who had all afternoon to kill and wanted to impress their recipient with both vocabulary and penmanship. The act of writing a letter was seen as an art form, a gentle duel between wit and ink, and once that letter was sealed, stamped, and sent, the waiting began. And that's where the addiction kicked in, because the Victorians didn't just write letters, they lived for letters. They waited for them. They stalked the mailman like he was delivering handwritten salvation. Multiple deliveries a day meant people could send a message in the morning, receive a reply by lunch, and start an entirely new thread of conversation by dinner. Imagine if you could send someone a text in the morning asking, "Do you want soup tonight?" and then get a formal reply by 2 p.m. stating only if it's mutton, regards. It was efficient, excessive, and just a little bit absurd. The result? Postal fever, a nationwide obsession with correspondence that transformed the humble letter into the Victorian equivalent of a scrollable timeline. Everyone had something to say, whether it was family news, poetic ramblings, thinly veiled insults, or weirdly detailed observations about the weather. And every letter received was a mini-event. People saved them, displayed them, reread them until the ink started to fade and the emotional drama began to feel vintage. Victorians didn't check their phones. They checked their front doors like caffeine-addled pigeons waiting for gossip. What makes this phenomenon all the more fascinating is that, unlike today, sending a letter wasn't just a tap and send. You needed paper, ink, a steady hand, a stamp, or enough money to pay the postman directly, and if you were feeling extra fancy, a wax seal that screamed, "I definitely overthought this message," and yet people did it, all the time, for everything. Births, deaths, lunch plans, misunderstandings, awkward apologies, unsolicited opinions about someone's hat. It all went through the mail. The social expectations around letters also meant that not replying was basically ghosting someone before that term even existed. If you didn't send a thank you note, you were practically committing social arson. There were even etiquette manuals instructing you how to phrase your letters properly, because nothing says friendship like being judged for poor sentence structure. So why did it matter so much? Because the mail was more than communication. It was identity. It was presence. It was proof that you were connected to something bigger than yourself, a family, a city, a lover, a rival. It was a bridge across physical distance, and a lifeline in a world that could feel lonely, chaotic, and rapidly changing. Victorian society was full of rules, roles, and routines, but the letter gave people a personal, portable outlet to express thoughts that might otherwise never be heard aloud. In other words, the Victorians weren't just addicted to mail because they had nothing better to do. They were addicted because, for the first time, they could be. The infrastructure, the education, the technology, and the culture had finally aligned to make the written word a part of daily life, not just for the elite, but for the average person who wanted to feel less average, one envelope at a time. So yes, the 1800s were filled with grime, soot, and unfortunate facial hair. But if there was one thing the Victorians could count on, it was that sometime today, somewhere on a street corner, a letter was making its way to someone's trembling hands, and it just might change everything. In the year 1840, Britain did something truly revolutionary. No, they didn't invent another machine powered by steam and mild panic. They introduced something far more dangerous, affordable communication. With the launch of the penny post, anyone with a single penny and an opinion could unleash their thoughts onto unsuspecting friends, relatives, or unfortunate officials. It was like opening the floodgates of the national brain, and nobody was safe. Before this postage shake-up, sending a letter wasn't just expensive. It was a logistical nightmare that made writing home feel like planning an international expedition. The cost of mailing was based on the distance the letter had to travel and how many sheets of paper you used. You could be charged more for adding a postscript than for buying lunch. Worse still, the recipient, not the sender, often had to pay for it. Imagine being guilt-tripped into paying to read your cousin's 4-page rant about garden snails. No thank you. Enter Sir Rowland Hill, a man whose forehead was as high as his ideals. He proposed a wild idea. What if everyone paid the same flat rate, just 1 penny, to send a letter anywhere in the country? He was laughed at, then argued with, then ignored, and then finally Britain said, well, all right, let's give it a go. And so, in 1840, the penny post was born, alongside the world's first postage stamp, the legendary penny black. It featured a rather stern-looking Queen Victoria, because of course it did, and instantly became a hit. For just a penny, a coin you might have found in the depths of your waistcoat or the bottom of a chimney sweep's boot, you could now send a letter to anyone, anywhere in the UK. And just like that, Britain became a nation of enthusiastic amateur novelists. People who had never written more than a shopping list were now composing epic epistles about the weather, the neighbours, and the emotional betrayal of someone forgetting your birthday. Letter writing wasn't just a chore, it was a pastime, a passion, a national sport. For just 1 penny you could send a heartfelt confession, a passive-aggressive complaint, or a recipe that definitely gave someone food poisoning. The democratization of the mail system meant that communication was no longer the exclusive privilege of the upper classes who had time, servants, and enough ink to open a small stationery shop. Now the working and middle classes could join the epistolary fray, writing letters that ranged from genuinely touching to "someone please confiscate this man's pen." Victorian households became mini communication hubs. Children sent thank you notes to uncles they didn't remember. Teenagers sent overly poetic verses to people they'd met twice. And housewives perfected the art of the polite yet pointed inquiry. "Dear madam, I do hope your cat is well. Also, your hedge is now leaning into our vegetable patch." Of course, businesses were quick to take advantage. The postal system gave rise to a booming world of advertising by mail. Flyers, catalogues, and circulars began invading letterboxes like paper-based locusts. Charities mailed pleas for donations. Snake oil salesmen sent miracle cures. And somewhere in there, your grandmother's thank you note got lost between an ad for miracle hair tonic and a religious pamphlet warning about dancing. The penny post also reshaped geography. Suddenly, rural communities were connected to cities in a way that felt immediate and personal. A young woman in the countryside could send a letter to her brother in Manchester, and he could reply within days instead of weeks. That meant family ties could remain strong, romances could blossom across county lines, and nosy aunts could stay perfectly up to date on everyone's business. But perhaps most importantly, the penny post gave voice to people who had rarely been heard before. Servants could write letters home, soldiers could write to sweethearts, shopkeepers could correspond with suppliers without having to bribe a carrier pigeon. It leveled the playing field in a society obsessed with hierarchy. And while the content of many of these letters wasn't exactly Shakespeare, the sheer volume of correspondence meant that Victorian society was essentially crowdsourcing its emotional intelligence in real time. One letter might describe the horror of someone's pudding exploding. Another might contain unrequested advice about poultices. Another might be an apology for something that happened at a picnic in 1837. But it was all out there, in the open, in envelopes. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some newspapers grumbled that the penny post was creating a nation of scribblers. Postmasters groaned under the avalanche of ink-splattered envelopes. And for every touching love letter, there were 10 rants about pie crust or an unflattering bonnet. But there was no turning back. The revolution was here, and it only cost a penny. The penny black itself became a collector's item and in a way a symbol of a Britain in flux, no longer a stiff, buttoned-up nation communicating only via servants and silence. This was now a country talking to itself at full volume on paper. The Victorians hadn't just found a new way to send messages. They'd found a way to feel seen, heard, and on occasion mildly dramatic about liver paste. So if you ever wonder how Britain became so famously obsessed with letters, it all started with a single stamp, a single coin, and a wildly optimistic idea that everyone should have the right to complain in writing. If you think today's notification pings are overwhelming, spare a thought for the poor Victorians who, without a single app in sight, still managed to experience something that was functionally identical to living in a group chat that never ever stopped. And it wasn't just once or twice a day. Oh no, in major cities like London, the post was delivered up to 12 times daily. That's right, 12. As in, by the time you'd buttered your toast, someone could have replied to your letter about the toast. You could wake up to a letter, reply to it before breakfast, and have an answer back before you'd even digested the toast in question. Victorians were operating on a level of communication urgency that would make a modern TikToker sweat. They didn't just write letters, they lived them, ate with them, slept with them nearby. Some of them probably even talked to the envelope before sealing it. And this wasn't just a London quirk. Other major cities had similarly frequent deliveries, though London definitely led the charge in turning mail into a high-speed relay race. The Royal Mail employed an army of postmen, messengers and couriers who zigzagged through the streets like caffeinated greyhounds in full uniform. If you ever wondered why Victorian novels are so long, it's probably because the authors were trying to beat the next delivery to the punch. Now, to be clear, these weren't all deliveries to your front door. The 12-a-day system often included multiple pickups and drops at key points, businesses, collection boxes and receiving houses. But the volume was staggering nonetheless. A letter could cross London in a few hours. You could make lunch plans, cancel them, reschedule, apologize and send a follow-up message saying you'd be late, all by mail, and all in the same day. It was like living in a group chat where the typing never stopped, only with more ink and fewer emojis. This hyper-efficient system worked because the Victorians, being the masters of tightly wound formality, had something modern messaging lacks: structure. Every delivery had a timetable. Mailboxes had strict pickup hours. People actually expected punctuality from the post. In a world without GPS, digital tracking, or angry emoji reactions, this was a communication system that ran with near-obsessive precision. Businesses loved it. You could place an order for goods in the morning, confirm the delivery by lunchtime, and start complaining about the wrong shade of ivory by dinner. For merchants and tradespeople, it was like having email, if your inbox wore a top hat and arrived on foot. But it wasn't just commerce that benefited. Personal communication thrived. Couples could write back and forth multiple times in a single day, basically long-distance relationships with local postage. Imagine the drama of a breakup letter arriving just hours after a love letter, or the awkwardness of both being sent at the same time and crossing paths somewhere near Fleet Street. The postman probably deserved hazard pay for emotional whiplash alone. This frantic pace created an entire postal rhythm to urban life. Some Victorians even scheduled their days around mail collection and delivery times. There were preferred hours to write, hours to check the box, and optimal times to expect a reply. It was the original social media algorithm, except instead of hashtags, you had wax seals and tightly controlled penmanship. And let's not forget the postmen themselves, who were some of the most visible and overworked figures in Victorian society. They weren't just messengers, they were part of people's daily lives. You knew your postman. You likely saw him several times a day. He might know more about your love life than your clergyman. There's a real chance he was greeted more warmly than your spouse, particularly if he brought good news or theatre tickets. What made all of this possible, of course, was the rapid urbanization and infrastructure boom of the 19th century. London, especially, was a city that practically demanded this high-speed postal system just to stay functional. Horse-drawn mail coaches, foot messengers, and eventually trains and pneumatic tubes were all employed to move messages faster than your average Victorian fainting spell. And yet, this postal hyperactivity came with its own social pressures. Because if a letter could arrive in hours, then so could the expectation that you'd respond in hours. Procrastination was a social sin. Ghosting someone by mail? Practically treason. People who delayed their replies risked being branded rude or worse, uninterested. A missed delivery could lead to misunderstandings, missed opportunities, or tragic miscommunications that would later fuel at least 6 chapters of a Victorian novel. Still, for many, the system was a marvel, a small miracle, a kind of analog magic trick that made cities feel smaller, relationships feel closer, and gossip travel faster than morality could catch up. So the next time you're annoyed that your email hasn't been answered in 5 minutes, just remember, the Victorians were out here sending letters faster than some people return text messages today, and they did it while wearing a corset, dodging manure, and holding a candle. Now that is dedication to communication. In the Victorian era, falling in love wasn't about swiping right. It was about writing left to right across an expensive piece of stationery with the exact amount of flourish to suggest you were interested, but not so interested that it looked desperate. Because if romance today is complicated, Victorian love was a 12-step dance done entirely in ink. This was courtship by quill, where the humble love letter reigned supreme as the most powerful, poetic, and occasionally passive-aggressive tool in a would-be lover's arsenal. It was where emotion met etiquette, where hearts fluttered and hands cramped from overuse of the word ardent. At a time when public displays of affection were considered wildly improper, accidentally brushing elbows was practically a proposal. Letters provided a private outlet for desire, longing, and emotionally intense observations about someone's handwriting. In the confines of a folded page, one could say what society forbade. You could admire a lady's eyes, praise her pianoforte skills, or hint ever so gently that her presence made your soul feel like spring had arrived early. And believe me, they hinted. Victorians weren't exactly direct in their affections. A true romantic confession might go something like, "To gaze upon your silhouette at twilight fills my heart with the gentle ache of rose petals in November," which roughly translates to, "I like you a lot." Victorian flirting was 90% floral metaphors and 10% praying your servant didn't read it first, because yes, privacy wasn't exactly guaranteed. These letters were often intercepted by nosy family members, over-involved servants, or scandal-hungry siblings. That meant every word had to walk a tightrope between sincere and socially acceptable. If you dared to suggest actual passion, you risked reputational combustion. To help navigate this treacherous terrain, couples developed an entire language of coded affection. They borrowed from poetry, used symbolic references, and even included pressed flowers with specific meanings. A red rose? Love. A pansy? Thoughts of you? A dead moth? Okay, that one probably wasn't romantic. For many Victorian women, especially those from middle or upper class backgrounds, letters were often the only way they could engage in open dialogue with a potential suitor. Social conventions dictated that most interactions were supervised, timed, and conducted under the disapproving gaze of a chaperone who had clearly forgotten what fun was. But a letter? That was a loophole. It was personal, it was intimate, and if written skillfully, it could get past both a father's scrutiny and a mother's passive judgment. Men, for their part, threw themselves into the task with everything from flowery prose to dramatic declarations. Some wrote daily, others included miniature drawings or carefully chosen verses. It wasn't uncommon for love letters to span several pages and reference shared walks, glimpsed smiles, or the tragic injustice of living in separate boroughs. And while we may now chuckle at their intensity, these letters were often heartfelt masterpieces, complete with wax seals, ornate script, and enough perfume to fumigate a carriage. They were saved in drawers, hidden under pillows, and sometimes kissed before bedtime. We don't recommend that last one, especially if the ink wasn't dry, but not all of it was innocent mooning and rose petals. Some letters crossed the line into the downright steamy, well, as steamy as you could get while still calling someone miss. Entire affairs took place through the post, maintained by pages of breathless prose and coded references that would make modern sexting look like a user manual. Illicit romances were especially common among the wealthy, who often married for status and found emotional connection elsewhere, preferably by candlelight and at a safe postal distance. These covert correspondences might be delivered via trusted servants or left at secret locations, like under a particular stone in a garden wall. Victorian lovers got creative. They had to, because being caught could mean ruin, shame, or at the very least an excruciatingly awkward dinner party. For those not ready to dive into full romantic declarations, the friendship letter was a popular warm-up. It allowed for vague compliments, deep thoughts, and just enough emotional ambiguity to make the recipient question whether they were being courted or philosophically admired. The tension in these letters was exquisite and maddening. And let's not forget the rejection letters, which could be just as poetic as the love ones. A proper Victorian refusal wasn't a cold no thanks, it was a lyrical sigh wrapped in good intentions. Something like, "Though I hold your esteem in the highest regard, I must decline with the sorrow of a swan departing winter," which means, "I'd rather marry a damp hat than continue this correspondence." These letters, whether successful or not, were tangible evidence of desire, vulnerability, and a time when expressing affection took effort, a lot of it. You had to think, feel, write, fold, seal, walk, and post, all without accidentally setting off a scandal, and in a world where so much was rigidly controlled by class, gender, and expectation, the love letter was a small act of rebellion, a way to say, "I see you, I choose you." Also, your poetry critique was a bit harsh, but I forgive you. So next time you dash off a hasty you-up text, remember that the Victorians were crafting emotional novellas by candlelight, in gloves, with ink that smudged if you sighed too hard. And somehow, despite it all, they still managed to make each letter feel like a love story, and sometimes a very inconvenient scandal waiting to unfold. So far, the Victorian Post has sounded like a quaint parade of love notes and dinner plans, written in elegant cursive and delivered with gentlemanly punctuality. But beneath all the florals and polite sign-offs lurked something far more sinister: anonymous letters, gossip campaigns, and enough handwritten slander to make a modern group chat look like a church bulletin. Yes, Victorians weaponized the mail, and they did it with gusto. While many used the post for affection, communication, or the occasional overblown pudding recipe, others realized something deliciously evil when nearly everyone had access to mailboxes, and stamps were cheap. You could ruin someone's life from the comfort of your own fainting couch. Enter the poison pen letter, a term as dramatic as the contents it described. These were anonymous letters sent to harass, blackmail, defame, or terrify the recipient. Sometimes they threatened exposure of secrets. Sometimes they were just cruel. and occasionally they were so unhinged they sounded like they'd been written by someone who had inhaled too much ink and was deeply mad at the world. Nothing says I love drama like licking a stamp before ruining someone's social life. In the 19th century, a letter delivered without a signature was rarely a love note. It was a red flag wrapped in an envelope. These messages often accused recipients of immorality, theft, infidelity, or perhaps worst of all in Victorian society, improper table manners. And because mail had become so fast and so private, these little bombs could be sent quickly, repeatedly, and without a trace. Victorian newspapers loved nothing more than reporting on the fallout. Headlines screamed about mysterious letters that led to duels, divorces, and dramatic fainting spells. There were court cases, street confrontations, even mobs formed because someone received a note claiming their neighbor was hiding a dark secret, or had stolen someone's best silverware, a crime of deep importance. These poison pen letters were often filled with Gothic flair. Writers disguised their handwriting, clipped words from newspapers, yes, Victorian ransom letter style, or used fake names like a true friend or a concerned citizen, which were rarely either. What made these letters especially terrifying was that they struck at the heart of Victorian values, reputation, propriety, and the illusion that everything behind lace curtains was just fine. And the targets? No one was off limits. Servants, who are often caught in the crossfire of household feuds, sent and received plenty of these. If a butler was suspected of sneaking extra brandy, he might wake up to a letter calling him a drunkard. A scullery maid deemed too flirtatious might receive a warning from an anonymous moral protector who just happened to live 2 streets over and enjoy making judgments. Middle-class women were also frequent targets because of course they were. A slightly shorter hemline, too many appearances at the haberdasher's, or a suspiciously long walk with a gentleman could lead to a flurry of accusatory mail. Entire reputations were shredded from behind closed doors without a single confrontation ever occurring. And don't think the upper classes were immune. High society loved to devour its own, and the post was the perfect method. Unwelcome suitors, envious rivals, or bored aristocrats with too much time on their hands could stir scandal simply by dropping a letter into the nearest postbox and letting society do the rest. Even small-town communities were riddled with these inked grenades. A local rector might receive a letter accusing him of moral hypocrisy. A baker might be warned about keeping company with the widow too often. Entire village feuds were carried out with quills and ill intent, each side trying to out-scandal the other in a battle of envelopes and innuendo. One of the most famous cases of poison pen paranoia occurred in Great Wheeley, Staffordshire, in the 1890s, where mysterious letters and animal mutilations triggered a public hysteria and false accusations. The case involved George Adalji, a young solicitor of Indian descent who was wrongly accused and imprisoned, highlighting not just the cruelty of anonymous letters, but also the very Victorian blend of racism, moral panic, and administrative incompetence. The government eventually had to take poison pen letters seriously. By the late 19th century, sending malicious anonymous correspondence became a criminal offence under laws related to harassment and intimidation. The post office, bless its ink-stained heart, suddenly had to double as an arm of the justice system, trying to keep track of who was turning paper into psychological warfare. But perhaps the most Victorian part of this entire mess was that, despite the damage these letters caused, people kept them. They tucked them into drawers, passed them around to friends, or even framed them as proof that their enemies were both petty and poorly educated. After all, what's the point of being slandered if you can't display it next to your china? The truth is, the dark side of Victorian mail was always there, lurking behind the polite forms of "Dear Sir" and "Yours faithfully." Because when you give a society that values secrecy, status, and passive aggression a fast, affordable delivery system, well, disaster is just a postage stamp away. Behind every Victorian love letter, scandalous threat, or poorly punctuated recipe was a real human being with aching feet and a canvas satchel bursting with secrets, the postman. In a world obsessed with correspondence, the Victorian postal worker was both the nation's most beloved guest and its most underpaid therapist. Rain or shine, cholera or fog, they were there uniformed, dependable, and dangerously informed. Before the Victorian era, postal delivery was a bit of a Wild West affair. If you wanted to get a letter somewhere, you might have relied on a stagecoach, a friend travelling that way, or a suspiciously fast carrier pigeon. But, as Britain industrialised, so did its need for a reliable communication network. Enter the professional postal worker, a new class of uniformed heroes who crisscrossed cities, towns and villages with the urgency of someone sprinting toward a tea break. The uniform was iconic, a dark blue coat with brass buttons, matching cap, and sometimes a satchel so large it looked like it could carry a week's worth of emotional damage. It wasn't just for looks. This outfit became a symbol of trust, a walking reassurance that the system worked. People didn't just recognize their postman, they knew him. In many neighborhoods, the postman was greeted like a minor celebrity, except with more reliable scheduling and significantly more paper cuts. Postmen walked so much they didn't need a gym, they just delivered heartbreak and overdue rent notices for cardio. And they really did walk, miles upon miles, day after day. Urban postmen, especially in London, might cover 10 to 15 miles per shift, lugging heavy bags full of wax-sealed confessions and overdue bills. Rural postmen had it even harder, crossing muddy lanes, braving winter fogs and navigating roads that were less road and more a cow made a decision to lie here. Despite the grueling labour, these workers were shockingly punctual. Victorian post was a clockwork affair and postmen had strict timetables. If they were late, someone's dinner plans could collapse. If they missed a delivery, a love letter might arrive after a breakup. The stakes were high, and so postmen became some of the most respected public servants in Victorian society. They were also, it must be said, accidental social hubs. Since they interacted with virtually everyone in a neighbourhood, they ended up knowing everything: who was in love, who was feuding, who had received 5 letters in one day, and blushed suspiciously after reading them. Some postmen quietly took on matchmaking roles, nudging flirtatious correspondences along or accidentally delaying rival suitors' letters. Others became unofficial gossip columnists, delivering not just letters but the slyly raised eyebrow that said, "You won't believe what came through the system today." And because they were trusted with so much, postmen often acted as verbal messengers too. If someone wasn't home, they might pass along a spoken note. If an elderly resident couldn't write, they might help compose a short letter or read one aloud. They were part courier, part confidant, and occasionally part therapist, though sadly not paid accordingly. Of course, with great access came great temptation, and not every postman resisted. A few infamous cases popped up in the newspapers where letters were stolen, delayed, or opened for a peek. There were even instances of blackmail or lost love letters that mysteriously vanished between sorting room and doorstep. But these were rare. For the most part, Victorian postal workers took their duties seriously. They weren't just delivering mail, they were delivering dignity and scandal, but mostly dignity. As the postal system grew, so did the workforce. The Victorian era saw the introduction of mail coaches, railway sorting cars, and even telegraph delivery boys, all of whom formed the arteries of this increasingly complex network. There were sorting clerks, regional postmasters, and a robust system of checks, balances, and occasionally yelling. One unsung group within the workforce, the postwomen. Though rare and usually confined to wartime or rural routes, women did take on delivery roles, especially later in the Victorian period. Often widows or women needing extra income, they carried the same weight, literally and figuratively, and received far less glory, but they walked their routes just the same, bringing with them letters, gossip, and a quiet sense of defiance. Despite the exhausting hours and heavy loads, many postal workers served for decades, retiring with worn boots and a head full of stories they'd never dare repeat. They were honoured with medals, pensions, and the occasional fruitcake at Christmas. More importantly, they earned the affection of a public that desperately needed them, because in an age where everything seemed to be changing — technology, class structure, city skylines, The postman was a constant, a familiar face, a daily visitor with news from afar and the silent knowledge of what lay inside every envelope. He might not have written the stories, but he carried them, every heartbreak, every secret, every flirtation, every scandal. So next time you imagine Victorian life as carriages and corsets, picture this too: a man in a blue uniform, trudging through fog, delivering a bundle of someone else's joy, grief, confusion, or poetry, 3 times before tea. To the Victorians, writing a letter wasn't just about sending a message, it was a performance, a statement, a soul-bearing monologue with ink blots. You didn't just jot something down and slap on a stamp, you composed it, as though every letter might one day be discovered by future generations and debated in literature class. Victorian letter writing was a full-blown national obsession, and like all obsessions, it came with its own rules, rituals, and delusions of grandeur. This was a time when someone could spend an hour composing a 2-page letter to thank their aunt for a handkerchief and still feel like they'd only scratched the emotional surface. Entire lives were chronicled through paper, pen, and more emotional flourish than a Victorian heroine fainting at the sight of a wilting rose. And they didn't just write letters, they were taught how to do it properly. Enter the etiquette manuals. Dozens of them, possibly hundreds. Entire books dedicated to instructing the average citizen on how to write a note of condolence without sounding smug, or how to flirt without being mistaken for a libertine. Titles like The Complete Letter Writer, or How to Write with Elegance and Feeling, were devoured by men, women, and possibly some very literate cats. These guides walked readers through every imaginable scenario. How to decline an invitation with grace, how to ask for money without sounding desperate, how to pen a marriage proposal without passing out at the desk. Victorian letters were so dramatic you half expected them to end with exit pursued by a bear. The expectations were sky high. A proper letter had structure, tone, and flair. It opened with a respectful salutation, never too casual unless you were courting ruin. It included elegant phrasing, carefully balanced emotion, and just the right amount of verbosity to show you'd attended school, or at least knew someone who had. And it closed with a flourish: your most obedient servant with deepest regard, or for the romantically reckless, ever yours. Even the physical presentation mattered. Paper quality was judged. Ink color had social implications. Blue was acceptable, red was scandalous. Some people even matched their stationery to their outfit, because nothing says I'm emotionally stable like coordinating your correspondence with your waistcoat. There was also the art of spacing. A truly masterful letter knew when to give the eye a break. No reader wanted to be attacked by a wall of ink. Margins were generous, paragraphs were polite, and heaven help you if you smudged the signature. Legibility was next to godliness. But the real magic happened in the content. These weren't brief messages, these were epics. Diaries disguised as greetings. Victorians poured their thoughts into their letters the way modern people pour thoughts into long, emotionally fraught texts they immediately regret sending. Letters could be poetic, filled with metaphors about seasons, birds, or the moral symbolism of the moon. A simple "I miss you" might arrive as, "Since your absence, the garden has seemed less vivid, the birds more mournful, and even the bread pudding somewhat despairing." They could also be painfully formal. A job inquiry might begin with, "Esteemed sir, I venture to address you regarding the possibility of employment, humbly entreating your indulgence for this intrusion upon your valuable time," which is Victorian for, "Hi, are you hiring?" This obsession with form wasn't just snobbery, it was a national identity. To write well was to be civilized, educated, and worthy of respect. Letter writing became a rite of passage. Children were taught to write thank you notes as soon as they could hold a pen, and teenagers practiced emotional restraint by composing over-polite notes to people they secretly wanted to marry. Entire relationships were maintained through written drama, with some letters carrying more tension than a Bronte novel in a thunderstorm. A poorly phrased sentence could be misread as a slight. Too many exclamation marks. Desperate. Too few. Cold. The stakes were social, emotional, and sometimes legal. And then there were the letter-writing clubs. Yes, these existed. Groups of people who gathered specifically to read, critique, and perfect their correspondence. Imagine a book club, but instead of novels, everyone brought drafts of birthday greetings and breakup notes to be dissected like Shakespearean soliloquies. Even public figures participated in the drama. Famous authors like Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Oscar Wilde were prolific letter writers, with personal correspondence that could rival their published works in flair, emotion, and sheer length. These weren't just notes, they were events. People collected them, published them, and argued over their meaning decades later. In Wilde's case, some were even used in court, because of course they were. What's astonishing is how seriously this was all taken. Today you might dash off a quick receipt and feel accomplished. But in Victorian times, a hasty note without the appropriate poetic structure could ruin your social reputation. To write a bad letter was to fail at being properly human. You were expected to charm, to persuade, to impress, not just with your words, but with your very soul on paper. In the end, letter writing wasn't just a skill, it was a national performance art, acted out one envelope at a time. The Victorians turned ink and paper into weapons, love songs, condolences, apologies, and identity. It wasn't communication, it was theatre, and every postbox was a stage. By the height of the Victorian era, the postal system had become such a marvel, so fast, so efficient, so reliable that people started to test it, and by test we mean abuse it in ways that defy all logic, common sense, and occasionally the laws of physics. Forget love letters and party invitations. Victorians decided the mail could and should handle everything, including live animals, construction materials, and in one famous case, actual human children. That's right, the Victorian Post wasn't just a mail service, it was a bizarre version of Amazon Prime, where your delivery might arrive with wings, legs, or the faint sound of mooing. Let's begin with the truly absurd headline. Yes, people mailed themselves. Now this wasn't some steampunk teleportation experiment gone wrong. It was in fact quite literal. Individuals would pack themselves in crates or disguise themselves as parcels to hitch free rides, particularly on railway mail services that allowed letters and packages to travel cheaply. In 1849, a man named Henry Brown famously escaped slavery in the American South by mailing himself in a wooden box to abolitionists in the North. And while that wasn't Victorian England, the story caught headlines in Britain and fueled similar postal escapades by adventurous or incredibly cheap Victorians who figured, if it's good enough for a fruitcake, it's good enough for me. But that's just the beginning. Victorians also mailed bees. Yes, bees, whole hives of them, carefully packaged, presumably with some very polite note warning, "Do not shake," and sent buzzing across the country to other beekeepers. It was considered entirely normal, provided you didn't mind your mail hissing audibly. The Royal Mail even developed procedures to deal with bee post because nothing says well-oiled government institution like a contingency plan for airborne insects in parcels. Other living things followed: birds, snakes, lobsters, kittens, and once, reportedly, a small pig. One can only imagine the sorting room atmosphere on those days, a chorus of squeaks, oinks, and feathers, all politely labelled with postage and a return address. If it fit in a box and didn't eat through the envelope, chances are someone slapped a stamp on it and called it Tuesday, and then came the bricks. In what can only be described as the Victorian DIY postal challenge, people began mailing building materials, bricks, planks of wood, even full stone slabs. Some were sent for novelty's sake. Others, like enterprising stonemasons and companies, used the mail to deliver samples to clients. And while the post office didn't exactly encourage it, the rules didn't technically forbid it. So if your Victorian cousin wanted to mail you a literal wall, he technically could, but perhaps the most gobsmacking detail of all was that people mailed children. Yes, actual living children, tiny humans, with stamps. To be fair, this wasn't an everyday practice, and it didn't involve stuffing kids into mailbags. But in some documented cases, especially in rural areas, families took advantage of parcel post rules and simply addressed the child. A label was attached, a stamp applied, and the child, usually escorted by a very confused postman, was delivered to the relative like a particularly fidgety loaf of bread. Nothing screams responsible parenting like mailing your child and hoping Royal Mail doesn't bend the corners. This strange phenomenon was more common in the early 20th century, technically just post-Victorian, but it was a natural outgrowth of the late 19th century mindset. If it had an address and legs, why not post it? Of course, not all oddities were alive. People mailed wigs, shoes, opera tickets, hair, entire wheels of cheese, and once a mummified hand, because the Victorians never passed up a chance to be creepy and logistical. Some of this madness stemmed from genuine necessity. Rural residents, especially in Scotland and Wales, often had few shops nearby and relied on mail for all manner of goods. If you needed a replacement boot heel, it came by post. If your cousin made jam, she'd wrap it in cloth, stuff it in a tin, and trust that Her Majesty's service would deliver it intact and unleaked. It didn't always work, but a great deal of this oddball mailing was also just Victorian mischief. People loved testing the boundaries. It became a national pastime to send absurd or oversized objects, just to see how far the post office would go before snapping. One newspaper encouraged readers to test the system by mailing increasingly bizarre items, and readers gleefully obliged to the credit of the Royal Mail. They delivered, quite literally. They adapted, evolved, and only occasionally wrote back saying, "Please stop sending eels in boxes labelled art supplies." By the end of the Victorian era, the post had become more than a service. It was a cultural experiment in what could be boxed, stamped, and delivered with dignity. And if that meant occasionally handing a goat to a startled housemaid, then so be it. Because to the Victorians, the post wasn't just for words, it was for everything. Letters, love, livestock, and every now and then, a toddler in a coat with a tag that said "To Grandma's house, please." At first glance, the Victorian postal system might just look like a very enthusiastic delivery service for overly long love letters and occasional bees, but scratch beneath the wax seal and you'll find something far more profound. The post didn't just deliver messages, it helped create a national identity. In fact, you could argue that no institution in Victorian Britain, aside from maybe Queen Victoria's face on everything, did more to knit the sprawling empire into a single functioning society than the humble post. Mail was the thread that wove together distant regions, social classes, and family trees that had grown tangled across 3 counties and 2 colonies. Let's begin with nationalism, not the angry chest-thumping version, but the quieter kind that makes you feel part of something bigger because your letter to Dundee arrives from Devon in just 2 days and it only cost a penny. The mail shrank the nation. Suddenly, someone in Cornwall could stay in touch with their cousin in Yorkshire, or a London merchant could trade with a shopkeeper in Belfast, all without relying on unpredictable coaches or shouting from hillsides. This wasn't just convenient, it was transformative. It created a sense of shared experience. People were reading the same newspapers, responding to the same political events, and gossiping about the same aristocrats. For the first time, an island full of distinct local cultures began to feel like one country. Thanks to a mail service that connected everyone with unnerving reliability and the occasional whiff of envelope glue. Even commerce changed forever. Businesses flourished with postal support. Orders could be placed and confirmed by mail. Invoices were sent, receipts returned. Victorians were, in effect, inventing early e-commerce, just with slower download speeds and better penmanship. Rural communities, once isolated and economically stagnant, began to thrive thanks to postal access to catalogues, advertisements, and correspondence with urban suppliers. Entire industries were built on mail, from mail-order haberdasheries to insurance companies to matchmaking services. Yes, Victorian Tinder involved considerably more paper cuts, but the mail didn't just connect, it elevated. For many Victorians, especially those of the lower middle class, literacy and the ability to write letters became a powerful form of social mobility. If you could correspond, you could negotiate a better job, connect with family in new cities, or argue politely for your rights in letters to newspapers, employers, or members of parliament. This is where the post gets radical. It flattened the social landscape. In theory, the post didn't care if you were a duke or a chimney sweep. If you had the penny and the address, your voice could travel just as far. And while the reality of class discrimination was alive and well, the post gave ordinary people a tool to rise above their station, or at least complain about it with style. It also helped sharpen regional identity. Letters weren't just communications, they were cultural exports. A letter from Glasgow didn't read like a letter from Kent. Accents became spelling quirks, slang crept into sentences, and turns of phrase revealed geography as much as grammar. Through letters, people got a clearer sense of how the rest of the country spoke, thought, and rolled their eyes at the weather. Over time, this fostered not just national unity, but an appreciation of local flavor. And then there were the epic feuds. Before social media, before comment sections, there were letter battles, long, drawn-out, emotionally repressed wars fought in cursive. Families tore themselves apart over inheritance disagreements. Social clubs fractured over who insulted whom in line at the tailor, and newspapers were flooded with anonymous letters signed "a disgusted citizen" or, in one glorious case, "a gentleman with standards." These debates were slow, dramatic, and carried all the intensity of a Jane Austen novel directed by Quentin Tarantino. Before fights on social media, there were letter feuds, slower, angrier, and with much fancier handwriting. And it wasn't just private squabbles. Public discourse happened through letters to editors and serialized debates. It became a civic ritual. Every well-read citizen needed to know what a concerned taxpayer thought about the state of the city's cobblestones. The act of writing and receiving mail became part of the daily rhythm of life. People rose early to catch the first delivery, read their letters with tea, and often penned responses that very same afternoon. Homes had special furniture, writing desks, inkwells, stationery drawers, dedicated to correspondence. A well-ordered life, it was believed, included a well-ordered letterbox. And then there's the emotional impact. The post was often the only thread tying loved ones together over long distances. Soldiers, emigrants, and traveling professionals clung to letters as lifelines. They were keepsakes, comfort, proof of care and continuity in an ever-changing world. It was how you knew someone still remembered you. By the close of the 19th century, the Victorian post had transformed from a utility into a kind of national nervous system, one that buzzed, ticked, and shuffled across cities, hills, and oceans, quietly reinforcing the idea that Britain was not just a geography, but a conversation. A long, verbose, occasionally passive-aggressive conversation, but a conversation nonetheless. By the end of the 19th century, the mighty Victorian postal empire stood tall. Uniformed postmen marching like clockwork, ink-stained fingers gripping fountain pens, and envelopes flying like social confetti. And then the telephone rang, and just like that, the letter lost its monopoly on human connection. To say Victorians resisted the decline of letter writing would be putting it mildly. They didn't just love the post, they were emotionally codependent on it. It was their diary, their soap opera, their therapy session, and their preferred method of ghosting someone. Just stop replying. But progress has a nasty habit of ignoring emotional attachment. And by the early 20th century, letter writing faced its most formidable enemies yet: the telegram, the telephone, and eventually, technology that didn't require licking anything. It started subtly. The telegram had already wormed its way into Victorian life, offering rapid-fire communication when someone didn't have time for flowery prose. If a letter was a candlelit dinner, the telegram was a sandwich thrown at your face, but it was undeniably faster, and for things like urgent births, deaths, or sudden engagements, or all three on the same weekend, speed mattered. The telephone was everything a letter wasn't: instantaneous, verbal, emotionally revealing. You couldn't edit your tone or rewrite your feelings 5 times before clicking send, and Victorians found that deeply uncomfortable. After all, how do you express proper disdain for someone's hat choices vocally, without first consulting an etiquette manual? The Victorians walked so their texts could run, and their constant messaging is why your phone buzzes every 5 seconds today. In truth, many Victorians clung to letters long after faster options arrived. They saw telephone conversations as vulgar and chaotic, all breath and blurt, no poetry. Letter writing still had elegance, dignity, and that satisfying moment when you got to cross out a word and rewrite it better, preferably with a smug flourish. But the world was speeding up. Urbanization exploded, daily life grew noisier, and people increasingly wanted answers now, not 3 days and 2 ink bottles later. Younger generations embraced the phone, offices installed switchboards, business moved to cables and cords. Still, the letter writers refused to go quietly. In fact, there was a late Victorian backlash, a wave of nostalgia where people clung even harder to the quill and stamp. Bookstores sold deluxe stationery sets and correspondence kits. Letter writing clubs refused to update. Articles with titles like "The Lost Art of the Letter" began appearing before it was even lost. Spoiler: people have been lamenting the death of letter writing since it was invented. And yet, inevitably, the numbers began to slide. Where once a person might write 6 letters a day just to manage dinner, they now called. The art of epistolary flirtation gave way to awkward phone pauses. Love letters became fewer and shorter. Some weren't even scented. Tragic. By the 1930s, letter writing was no longer the pulse of society. It was a quaint tradition, still practiced, but no longer essential. The post was still reliable, but it had lost its drama, its centrality, its heartbeat. Even the language of correspondence began to shift. No more "dearest cousin, I write to you beneath the gloomy shade of winter." Now it was "call me." But here's the twist. While the method faded, the obsession did not. Victorian Britain created a monster, a society built on the compulsive need to check for messages. That instinct didn't vanish. It evolved. The same dopamine surge Victorians felt hearing the postman's knock. It's the same flutter you get when your phone buzzes at 2 a.m., hoping it's not your boss. We've traded quills for thumbs, stationery for screens, but the compulsion to stay connected, to reach out, to refresh, to reply, that's pure Victorian energy. We still measure relationships by response time. We still panic over delayed messages. We still overanalyze punctuation in texts like Victorians did with ink loops in letters. He ended with a period. Is he mad at me? Even ghosting. Yes, the ancient art of not responding was alive and well in the 1890s. They just called it a chilling silence, or an unacknowledged note. Same emotional damage, fancier stationery. So if you're wondering why your group chat never sleeps, or why a silent inbox gives you existential dread, you can thank the Victorians. They turned communication into a daily ritual, a social expectation, a source of joy, panic, and petty revenge. And while we no longer lick stamps much, the culture they built still pulses in our pockets. Because long after the candles burned out and the inkwells dried up, one truth remained. Humans will always find a way to overshare, obsess, and overanalyze each other's messages, whether by letter or 3 a.m. text that reads "you up?" Before tanks, drones, or war-themed video games, warfare was mostly just mud, muskets, and trying not to be unalive of diarrhea before the enemy stabbed you. And if there's one thing 18th century armies were consistently bad at, besides battlefield hygiene, it was feeding their own soldiers. In the 1700s, marching into war didn't just mean facing bullets and bayonets. It meant resigning yourself to a diet that could best be described as culinary punishment. Imagine waking up to a breakfast of rock-hard bread that had been baked sometime during the previous dynasty. Lunch, salted meat so briny it could be used to mummify you from the inside. Dinner, cold, wormy gruel or nothing at all, depending on whether your supply wagon made it through the swamp this week. Food on the battlefield wasn't just bad, it was borderline mythical. Armies lived in a perpetual state of half-starvation, relying on scavenging, pillaging, and whatever your buddy didn't eat to survive. If you were lucky, you got hardtack, a delightful brick of flour and water, baked until it could double as masonry. If you were unlucky, your hardtack had a side order of weevils. Some soldiers even dunked it in water or soup just to soften the bugs up. You could say they weren't eating to live, they were negotiating with dinner. And don't expect refrigeration to save the day. It hadn't been invented yet. You had about 48 hours after meat was cooked before it became either dangerous, green, or both. Salt was the closest thing to preservation science anyone had, and it only worked if your goal was to turn meat into jerky and hope the mold didn't win. But if the food didn't kill you, the logistics might. Moving an army required not only muskets and men, but entire caravans of carts just to haul food, and those carts were often late, lost, or looted. When a commander drew up his grand battle plan, he had to hope the enemy didn't intercept the biscuit wagon first. Armies often collapsed, not because they lost on the battlefield, but because their dinner got eaten by goats 2 days before the fighting started. Disease, unsurprisingly, flourished in this culinary apocalypse. More soldiers died from dysentery, typhoid, and malnutrition than from actual combat. You could dodge a bullet, but you couldn't outrun rotten stew. If your army didn't have enough food, it didn't matter how sharp your bayonets were. You'd be too busy arguing over who got to eat the last onion peel. Now enter Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who could probably strategize an invasion with one hand and butter a croissant with the other. As brilliant as he was brutal, Napoleon understood something that many of his predecessors ignored. An army marches on its stomach, and his armies were marching everywhere. Italy, Egypt, Spain, and eventually into the Russian winter, like they were headed to a picnic. Spoiler, they were not. Napoleon didn't just want victories, he wanted sustainability. He knew his soldiers needed more than just iron will and revolutionary slogans. They needed real food, and food that wouldn't spoil while crossing a desert or camping in a snowstorm. Which led to one of history's most practical moves. In 1795, Napoleon's government offered a reward of 12,000 francs, a fortune at the time, to anyone who could come up with a new effective method of preserving food. This was no casual contest, it was a culinary moonshot, a call to arms for anyone who had ever looked at a wilted cabbage and thought, there must be a better way. Napoleon essentially told the inventors of France, I can win battles, but I need you to win dinner. Of course, there were some early submissions that probably should have stayed locked in the experimental basement, like drying food into powder so fine it required a chemistry degree to rehydrate, or pickling things that should never be pickled, e.g. raw eggs and sheep lungs, but it planted a seed. For the first time, food preservation became a matter of national security. It was a simple truth with world-changing implications. No matter how powerful your cannons were, no one was winning a war on an empty stomach. Napoleon had figured out that bullets could only go so far. Beans, beef, and bread, that's where the real power was. To summarize, by the end of the 18th century, European warfare had reached a boiling point. Literally, men were dying with stomachs emptier than their morale, and Napoleon, the pint-sized powerhouse with a god complex and a penchant for efficiency, decided enough was enough. If the Enlightenment could give us calculus, steam engines, and powdered wigs with structural integrity, then surely someone could figure out how to make beef last longer than a parade. What followed would change food forever, but first, it would involve boiling meat in bottles and hoping science caught up before everyone died of spoiled gravy. Long before microwaves, expiration dates, or that one guy who cans everything from cake to calamari, there was Nicolas Appert, a man who quite literally cooked his way into the annals of history. Not with culinary finesse, mind you, but with persistence, an alarming number of boiling pots, and the stubborn optimism of someone who looks at a shelf of glass jars and thinks, this is how I'll feed an empire. Appert wasn't a general or a scientist. He didn't command armies or wear a powdered wig while shouting about liberty and fraternity. He was a confectioner. Yes, his background was in sugar and jam, not sausages and battlefield logistics. But as it turns out, sugar isn't the only thing that can preserve life. When Napoleon's government issued its famous 12,000 franc food preservation prize in 1795, it was open season for inventors, cooks, and experimental lunatics across France. Appert, already a successful chef and candy maker, was intrigued. He may not have known much about warfare, but he knew how to keep things edible longer than nature intended, and that, in this case, made him more valuable than a dozen generals with maps. Apparat's method was both simple and completely mad. He began stuffing cooked food into glass bottles, sealing them with corks jammed in as tightly as a government tax, tying them down with wire, and then boiling the entire thing in giant cauldrons, vegetables, stews, meats. If it could fit in a jar, Appert was submerging it in a water bath like some kind of culinary baptism. His neighbors must have been horrified. Imagine walking past a 19th century French kitchen and seeing a man tenderly boiling beef inside what looks like an oversized perfume bottle. That's not dinner, that's a cry for help. But Appert didn't care. He was determined. For over a decade he toiled, tested, and tasted, possibly regrettably, refining his technique and expanding his jarred abominations from pickled peas to entire roast meats. The result? Something miraculous. The food, once sealed and boiled, didn't rot. It didn't turn green. It didn't explode with the scent of decay when opened after weeks or even months. It stayed edible. Not delicious necessarily, but not deadly either. That, in Napoleonic France, was enough to call it a scientific revolution. Keep in mind, germ theory didn't exist yet. No one knew why food spoiled or what caused illness. Louis Pasteur wouldn't come along and explain bacteria for another 60 years. So when Appert's preserved foods defied every expectation, it wasn't science, it was sorcery by soup. Appert didn't have the foggiest clue why his method worked. For all he knew, it could have been heat, pressure, divine intervention, or some kind of benevolent food ghost guarding the bottle. What he did know was this: boiling food until it begged for mercy, then sealing it in airtight glass, made it last longer than any soldier's morale during a Russian winter. In 1806, after over 10 years of experimenting, Appert submitted samples to the French Navy jars of vegetables, fruits and meats. They were stored, transported and inspected months later, and guess what? Still edible, possibly still recognizable, and most importantly, not poisoned. 3 years later, in 1810, Appert officially won the prize. The government awarded him the 12,000 francs and praised his method as the future of military provisioning. They also published his book, L'art de conserver pendant plusieurs années toutes les substances animales et végétales, the art of preserving animal and vegetable substances for several years, which is basically the world's first guide to home canning, written by a man who probably smelled like steamed ham year-round. But here's the punchline: Appert didn't patent his invention. Instead, he made it public so everyone, especially France, could benefit. This wasn't just generous, it was wildly selfless. Imagine inventing the 19th century equivalent of the refrigerator, and your first thought is, here, have it, feed the people. However, Appert's method had a flaw. He used glass bottles, which shockingly do not travel well in war. They break, shatter, and become medieval shrapnel when mishandled. The next leap would come from someone else, with a very different idea involving metal and a total disregard for easy opening. But we'll get there in Chapter 3. Still, Nicholas Appert's legacy was sealed tighter than one of his jars. He not only revolutionized how food could be preserved, he unknowingly laid the groundwork for modern food safety and long-term storage. He was the father of canning, the savior of rations, and possibly the only man in history who looked at a bubbling jar of lamb and said, yes, that's the future. And while the science behind his technique wouldn't be explained for decades, Appert didn't need theory. He had something better: sheer culinary audacity. If Nicholas Appert was the gentle food wizard who sealed stew in glass like a potion, the British were the blacksmiths who turned dinner into a blunt object. And it all starts in 1810, with a man named Peter Durand, who looked at Appert's delightful glass bottles and thought, you know what this needs? Several pounds of metal. Durand was a London merchant, not a chef, not a scientist, and not someone who particularly enjoyed exploding soup on the battlefield, but he saw potential in Appert's invention: glass, while excellent for looking classy in a kitchen, had one fatal flaw: it breaks. Soldiers, sailors and horses aren't exactly known for their gentle touch. What the world needed, Durand decided, was a food storage method that could survive war, weather, and whatever chaos a Napoleonic supply cart might endure. And so he patented an idea, a method for preserving food in vessels of tin. The concept was simple. Instead of using fragile bottles, why not pour food into metal containers, seal them up tight, and heat them just like Appert did? The result would be the same: food that stayed safe and edible, but wrapped in an armor shell tougher than half the army's helmets. And he wasn't wrong. Tin-plated iron cans were far more durable, especially for military use. They didn't shatter, they didn't crack, and they didn't leak stew on the captain's boots if you dropped one on deck. But in solving one problem, Durand accidentally created another, because these early cans weren't just sturdy, they were indestructible. The first generation of cans were handmade by metal workers. Each one had to be cut, shaped, soldered shut, and sealed with the kind of craftsmanship you'd expect from someone building a small tank. The average can was roughly the size of a brick, and just as thick. It wasn't something you opened, it was something you defeated. In fact, some early cans were sealed with lead solder so thick that just heating the container to sterilize the contents risked turning your rations into a leaden meat grenade. But hey, at least it wouldn't break. These metal-clad rations soon made their way into British naval use. Sailors aboard long voyages were given tinned meat, vegetables and puddings that could survive months or years at sea, but eating the food remained an ongoing negotiation. There were no can openers. That invention wouldn't appear for another 40 years, and we'll get into that delicious oversight later. Until then, your tools of choice were a chisel, a hammer, or just raw, brute rage. Soldiers often stabbed their cans open with bayonets, bashed them against rocks, or hacked them apart with whatever was nearby. One account from an Arctic expedition in the 1820s described opening a can with a musket ball. Another described a man using an axe to open his dinner. Imagine being cold, tired and half-starved, and your greatest enemy isn't the wilderness or the enemy army. It's a cylinder of tinned peas. Dinner became a full-contact sport. And what did you get for all that effort? Well, it depended. Some of the early cans held perfectly preserved food, which was a miracle. Others contained unidentifiable goop that may or may not have been meat at some point during the French Revolution. Labels were rare. Consistency was not guaranteed. It was like culinary roulette, except instead of a bullet, the chamber held soggy mutton in grey gravy. To add to the fun, the cans themselves weren't exactly manufactured in sterile conditions. Hygiene standards in early 19th century food factories ranged from mildly concerning to "please wear gloves, dear God." A can might arrive intact, but with mysterious contents that were either beef stew or ambitious bacteria colonies. If you didn't boil it again before eating, well, hope you said your goodbyes. Still, despite the heavy packaging, lead-line dangers, and the very real risk of slicing your hand open before you even got to the beans, the tin can worked. It was a revolutionary leap from Appert's glass bottles, a form of food preservation that could withstand long journeys, harsh conditions and blunt trauma. By the 1820s, commercial canning factories began to pop up across Britain, some producing 60 to 100 cans a day by hand. Not exactly mass production, but enough to keep warships stocked and explorers slightly less likely to starve. Peter Durand, for his part, didn't spend years in a lab or launch a culinary empire. He licensed his patent and faded into history. But his idea, food in a can, food you could drop off a balcony and still eat later, stuck. Literally and metaphorically. So yes, he made food preservation more practical. But he also created a dining experience that required tools, determination, and a strong wrist. Imagine a can so sturdy it could survive artillery. Great for food preservation, terrible if you're hungry. Let's be honest, when you think of wartime innovation, your mind probably goes to cannons, code breaking, or battlefield tactics, not an under-seasoned meatloaf sealed inside an iron drum But during the Napoleonic Wars and the decades that followed, canned food became an unexpected weapon in the military's logistical arsenal. It fed soldiers, prolonged campaigns, and in many cases caused gastrointestinal warfare entirely unrelated to the actual enemy. By the 1820s and 1830s, both British and French militaries had begun experimenting with canned food on the battlefield. The logic was simple. Armies needed reliable nourishment that didn't spoil, crumble, or vanish halfway through a march. The solution, unfortunately, came in the form of metal-encased culinary mysteries, cans so sturdy they could survive musket fire, but whose contents could emotionally damage even the toughest veteran. Early military rations included a dazzling array of uninspired options: preserved boiled beef, greyish mutton, sludgy vegetables, and the occasional pudding that had the texture of a damp sandbag and the flavour of mild despair. Labels were not always used or accurate, so soldiers often had to play guess the mystery meat at the end of a 20-mile march. Some descriptions from soldiers read more like crime reports than meal reviews. A French soldier once described his ration as unctuous beef jelly, which sounds like a medieval curse disguised as lunch. British troops, ever the masters of sarcasm, began calling their rations bully beef, a term that sounds hearty until you realize it refers to tough, over-salted meat compressed into a rectangular prism of regret. And then, of course, came the opening procedure, which often resembled a low-level bar fight. Remember, there were still no official can openers. Soldiers had to make do with whatever was on hand: bayonets, rocks, rifle butts, belt buckles, or in some cases their bare teeth and a questionable will to live. When your dinner requires a combat knife to access, you're not eating, you're dueling with your lunch. Many opted for the brute force method, slamming the can against a rock until it split, or stabbing it repeatedly like it owed them money. Others hacked them open with their swords or used gunpowder as an improvised explosive can opener, which tells you exactly how desperate things could get by supper time. And even if you succeeded in cracking one open without losing a finger or setting your tent on fire, you were then met with the contents, a lukewarm blob of protein slurry that may have once been beef, now looking like it had been marinating in sadness since the last revolution. Temperature, not a factor. Cans were rarely reheated in the field unless you had access to a fire and an unreasonable amount of patience, so most of the time soldiers just dug in cold. Imagine trying to enjoy congealed carrots and lamb fat in a trench while dodging musket balls. It wasn't dinner, it was punishment with a spoon. On particularly bad days, soldiers reported cans that had spoiled or rusted from the inside. Some contained foul-smelling sludge, others were swollen with gas from fermentation. One British journal entry politely referred to the contents of a spoiled can as animated stew. The polite part was the word stew. Despite all this, canned food remained in demand. Why? Because it was still better than the alternative, starvation. And the military was desperate to maintain supply lines that didn't rely on fresh livestock or fragile bread wagons. Canned food could be stored for months, tossed onto a ship or mule without a second thought, and issued with brutal efficiency. It was also unintentionally a great equalizer. Whether you were a lowly infantryman or a colonel with extra epaulets, your can of meat sludge looked exactly the same. There were no bonus spices for seniority, no ranking-based pudding tiers, just you, your can, and whatever medieval technique you used to open it. In time, soldiers began developing a grim camaraderie around the ritual of can opening. Some carved notches into their knives to fit the metal seams. Others swapped horror stories over who had the worst can that week. Spoiler, it was always the one that hissed when opened. And if your meal actually tasted decent, it was considered a military miracle worthy of celebration, or at least not immediate gagging. These early canned meals weren't designed for pleasure, they were designed for function, a calorie delivery system inside a food-grade fortress. Whether or not your stomach agreed with the contents was considered irrelevant. You ate it, you didn't die, probably, and you got back to marching. So yes, while gunpowder may have won battles, it was canned beef that helped win sustained campaigns. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't gourmet, but it was there, sealed in tin, waiting patiently for you to find a sharp object and the courage to face what was inside. And that's the story of early military meals, 1 part innovation, 1 part iron, and 3 parts digestive risk. You would think that if someone invented a sealed metal container full of food, the next logical step would be to invent a way to open it. But no, humanity, ever consistent in its ability to miss the obvious, decided to wait more than 30 years after the invention of the tin can before creating the can opener. That's right, the can was born in 1810, tough, tin-plated and smugly sealed. The can opener, however, that came limping into existence around 1855, long after generations of soldiers, sailors, explorers and frustrated picnickers had spent decades engaged in hand-to-can combat just to access their lukewarm mutton surprise. It's as if someone invented the bank vault before inventing the key, or invented pants with no zippers, or, as one might say, invented escape rooms before the clues. Congratulations, you're trapped with stew. So what happened in the meantime? Well, humans improvised, badly. Opening a can in the early 1800s was an activity that required tools, muscle, and emotional resilience. People used whatever they had on hand: knives, chisels, hammers, bayonets, screwdrivers, rocks, and in some truly unhinged cases, gunfire. If it was sharp, heavy, or vaguely dangerous, someone tried to open a can with it. A British explorer on an Arctic expedition reportedly shot a can open with a rifle. Another soldier is said to have used his teeth, which is a level of commitment to lunch most of us will never reach. The sheer level of violence required to access preserved meat was so routine that gashes and puncture wounds became a minor but frequent part of the meal prep process. It wasn't just soldiers either. Even civilians got in on the misery. Cans were being sold in shops, filled with exotic delicacies like salmon, turtle soup, and preserved tongue, which sounds less like food and more like a dare. But these delicacies came wrapped in a medieval test of strength. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was an upper body workout. Meanwhile, the manufacturers, perhaps sensing the public's struggle, responded with nothing. The average early can was so thick it could double as a building material. Some weighed over a pound, empty. The instructions were typically along the lines of cut around the top edge with a hammer and chisel, which is not what most people expect when preparing peas. And finally, after 3 decades of clanking frustration, the world was graced with the invention it had been so desperately lacking. The first can opener was patented in 1855 by Robert Yeats, a cutlery maker from England, and bless his heart, because his design looked like what would happen if a bottle opener got into a bar fight with a corkscrew. It was clunky, brutal, and required you to punch the blade into the lid and then saw your way around the rim like a carpenter, exorcising a demon from a biscuit tin. But it worked, sort of. It wasn't until 1870, when William Lyman introduced a rotating wheel-style can opener, that things finally started to resemble the modern kitchen tool we know today. Even then, the early models were still better at maiming than feeding. Safety standards were more of a suggestion, and more than one Victorian housewife probably lost a little dignity and possibly a fingertip just trying to open some peaches. And let's be clear, while this invention eventually made canned food more accessible, it didn't suddenly transform the experience into culinary bliss. The cans were still heavy, sometimes rusted, and the contents still smelled like they'd been stored since the previous century. But at least now, opening them no longer required a basic understanding of metallurgy. So why did it take so long? Why did no one think, hey, maybe the food should come out without a bayonet duel? There's no definitive answer, but it probably comes down to industrial priorities. The can was created to solve a logistical problem, preserve food, not to improve the eating experience. As long as the food didn't rot, nobody cared how many fingernails you lost trying to get to it. Opening it was your problem, a you problem, and thus the can openerless dark ages dragged on. Even after the invention of openers, they didn't become widespread right away. Many people still used knives, axes, or whatever their ancestors had passed down, most of which were not kitchen utensils. It was only in the 20th century, with mass production and home cooking on the rise, that can openers became as essential as the can itself. In hindsight, this delay seems almost comedic. The idea of packaging food in a near impenetrable vault and handing it to someone without a key feels like the kind of prank a time-traveling engineer would play. But for those early users, soldiers, sailors, civilians, it wasn't funny. It was just another reminder that human invention often moves in bold, ridiculous leaps, with the details catching up later. By the mid-19th century, canned food had officially outgrown its battlefield roots and set off on a bold new journey to feed the world, or at least mildly confuse it. Once the can opener caught up with the can, see previous drama, these tin-plated time capsules of nutrition began popping up everywhere, on ships, in trenches, in Arctic outposts, and eventually, in the sacred realm of school cafeterias. What started as a military solution had transformed into a full-blown symbol of industrial progress. The logic was simple. The more cans your society had, the more advanced you clearly were. What could say "we've made it" as a civilization more loudly than food that could survive decades, natural disasters, and questionable handling by 12-year-olds? Let's start with the high seas, where canned food quickly became the sailor's best friend and also their most enduring mystery. Prior to tins, long-distance voyages relied on salt pork, hardtack, and prayer. Scurvy was practically a shipmate, but with cans you could load a ship with preserved meat, fruit, and even soup that didn't require immediate exorcism. Suddenly, crews could eat peas in the middle of the Pacific or have a tin of peaches near the South Pole. It was magic, science, and possibly witchcraft, all rolled into one shiny container. Which brings us to the polar explorers, a special breed of human who looked at a map, saw the parts labeled certain death, and said, "Let's camp there." Expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic in the 19th and early 20th centuries absolutely relied on canned food. These icy pioneers packed thousands of tins into their sleds: beef, mutton, condensed milk, and a wide selection of foods designed specifically to not kill you by day 3. Of course, quality varied. Some tins were life-saving. Others contained horrors best left to the imagination or a future lawsuit. One notable example is the Franklin expedition of 1845, a voyage to find the Northwest Passage that ended with every crew member vanishing. Among many contributing factors, botched canned goods. Several tins were improperly sealed with lead solder, which slowly poisoned the crew over time. Nothing like dragging a sled across tundra while slowly marinating in heavy metal stew. And yet, despite the occasional toxic can, the idea stuck. Canned food equaled survival. It could go where humans couldn't or shouldn't and still show up to dinner on time. Back on solid ground, the Victorian middle class began embracing canned goods as a sign of modernity. Supermarkets didn't exist yet, but tins began appearing in general stores and pantries like strange metallic guests who refused to expire. They were neatly labeled, industrially uniform, and somehow comforting in their cold, utilitarian predictability. Marketing campaigns leaned hard into this. Canned pineapple, exotic luxury; tinned sardines, a meal of refinement; condensed milk, pure spreadable progress. Even royalty got on board. Queen Victoria herself received a tin of canned beef from her soldiers as a gift during the Boer War. It was considered patriotic. She may or may not have eaten it, but the gesture was preserved, literally and figuratively. Then came the 20th century, and with it the golden age of the can. 2 world wars turned the humble tin into a global culinary ambassador. Allied soldiers chowed down on spam, corned beef, canned stews, and mystery puddings from London to Luzon. Factories cranked out millions of tins daily. Supply chains revolved around them. If you opened a backpack in 1944, chances were high that something inside had been sealed in metal 6 months earlier and still looked weirdly confident about its flavor. By mid-century, canned food had become a staple in every home. It was practical, cheap, and lasted longer than most family pets. During the Cold War, it also became a survivalist's dream. The fallout shelter fantasy wasn't complete without shelves lined with beans, spaghetti hoops, and ravioli that could probably survive a nuclear winter and the next few presidencies. And somewhere in the middle of all that survival, strategy and spoilage avoidance, canned food crept into schools. What better way to serve large numbers of growing humans with rapidly changing metabolisms than mass-produced, easy-to-store food? School lunches began to feature canned corn, canned fruit cocktail, and the ever-iconic canned green beans, soggy, soft, and somehow able to taste like nothing and everything all at once. In fact, by the 1970s, canned goods were so ubiquitous they stopped being seen as futuristic and started being seen as standard. Entire cookbooks emerged featuring nothing but canned ingredients. Some of them should have been sealed and buried, but that's another chapter. The can had gone from invention to innovation to institution, and still, even after 2 centuries, it endures. Because here's the thing, nothing says advanced society like a food product that lasts longer than your average dynasty. Whether it's a cold can of beans in a foxhole, a tin of peaches on a mountaintop, or a school tray full of metallic-smelling vegetables, canned food has gone where fresh food fears to tread, and come back with a smug little hiss and a splash of lukewarm nostalgia. Canned food is often hailed as one of the greatest innovations in food preservation, but for every tale of life-saving rations and pantry preparedness, there's a shadowy chapter involving swollen cans, sour smells, and explosive regrets. Because while the can promised safety and shelf life, what it occasionally delivered was an unpredictable snack-based death trap. Let's start with the basics. The early 19th century tin can was a marvel of industrial ingenuity, but it also came with zero quality control and even less microbiology. Germ theory was still a glimmer in Pasteur's future lab goggles, and factory hygiene could best be described as ambitiously medieval. So while tins were supposed to be airtight food fortresses, sometimes they were more like metal time bombs with a side of gravy. One of the earliest and most infamous disasters involved the Franklin expedition, a British Arctic voyage launched in 1845 with 2 ships, over 120 crew members, and thousands of cans of preserved food. It was meant to be a triumph of exploration. Instead, it became an icy graveyard, a tragic reminder that food safety is not optional when you're hundreds of miles from the nearest snack bar. So, what went wrong? The cans, intended to keep the men fed through brutal winters, had been hurriedly produced in bulk, sealed with thick layers of lead-based solder, and in many cases improperly sterilized. That meant a delightful double threat. Not only did the leads slowly poison the men over time, causing everything from madness to organ failure, but the poorly sealed cans also let bacteria in, turning some of the food into festering toxic mystery paste. Autopsies of crew members conducted over a century later revealed alarmingly high levels of lead, along with evidence of botulism, a word that should never appear in the same sentence as dinner. This wasn't just a case of bad rations. It was a perfect storm of culinary negligence, one that turned sustenance into slow brewing sabotage. Botulism, in particular, is the VIP of canned food horrors, caused by Clostridium botulinum. It's a bacterium that thrives in low-oxygen environments like, say, the cozy interior of a sealed tin of green beans. If those beans weren't properly heated before sealing, congratulations, you've just invited one of the most lethal toxins known to science to your dinner party. Botulism doesn't mess around. A few nanograms can paralyze you. A full dose? Let's just say it doesn't end with a stomachache. And the worst part? It doesn't smell, look, or taste wrong. It's the silent, microscopic assassin of the pantry. Canned food safety eventually improved, but botulism didn't go away. Even today, outbreaks still occur, especially in home canning gone wrong, where amateur chefs turn their kitchens into accidental science experiments. A jar of homemade soup might look innocent, but if that lid didn't seal correctly, you're now gambling with culinary Russian roulette. Then there's the exploding can phenomenon, which sounds like a fun party trick, but is really just a warning sign your food is trying to escape. If a can bulges, leaks, or pops open with a hiss, it's not extra freshness, It's a bacterial coup in progress. Gas-producing microbes can build pressure inside the can until it literally bursts. The result is a high-velocity spray of meat chunks and shame. It's less dinner, more horror film prop. This wasn't just a concern in Victorian times. Even in the early 20th century, canned food recalls were common. Government inspectors in the US and Britain occasionally opened tins only to find maggots, mold, or entirely new ecosystems thriving inside. Some reports mentioned beef so rancid it had turned black and gelatinous, and vegetables that had achieved sentience, probably. In 1919, one American newspaper described a brand of canned chicken soup that smelled of engine grease and boiled leather. That same year, inspectors in London discovered a shipment of tinned mutton labelled for human consumption that was so rotten even local stray dogs refused it. When the dogs won't eat your food, it's time to rethink your recipe. Of course, not every can was a disaster, but enough of them were that public trust in canned goods took decades to earn and still hasn't fully recovered. There's a reason we instinctively tap the lid and squint before opening that ancient can of beans lurking in the back of the cupboard. There's a reason most people will eat a slightly expired yogurt but will run screaming from a dented can of ravioli. And so the can, once a triumph of preservation, earned a secondary reputation as a potential weapon, both in form, see Chapter 3's metal bricks, and content. It became a punchline, a hazard, and a minor phobia, all at once, because sure, it's food that lasts forever, unless it kills you first, kind of a snack-based lottery. It began as a sealed metal vault of dubious meat, opened only by the strong, the desperate, or those with access to a blacksmith. But after 2 centuries of explosions, lid poisoning, bent knives, and general confusion, the can has finally done what few inventions managed to do. It mellowed out. It evolved. It got better. It got, dare we say, convenient. Let's start with the final piece of the puzzle. The can opener finally caught up. After decades of being forced to open dinner like it was a dragon's treasure chest, consumers were granted relief in the form of ever-improving openers. The rotating wheel opener of the 1870s brought precision, if not comfort. By the 1920s, wall-mounted openers appeared in kitchens. And then came the true savior of fingers and patience alike, the pull tab. Invented in the 1950s and commercialized in the early 1960s, the pull tab, or pop top, was the result of engineers realizing that maybe, just maybe, food shouldn't require a toolbox. Suddenly, canned goods weren't just tough, they were accessible, and instead of dreading the sound of metal screeching under a dull blade, consumers were greeted with a simple pop, a clean peel, and a sense of smug modern superiority. The tin can walked so the pull tab could run, and also you could eat peaches without swearing at a knife. But the transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. By the mid-20th century, canned food had gone global, and not just as rations or emergency backup. It became a staple, a kitchen icon, a shelf warrior. During the World Wars, tinned food kept soldiers fed and sane-ish under trench conditions. Post-war, it followed them home, straight into the heart of 1950s domestic bliss. Suddenly, canned goods weren't sad or suspicious, they were modern. Housewives in heels and aprons proudly whipped up cream of mushroom surprise and spam loaf delight, aided by cookbooks with cheerful titles like 100 delicious things to do with canned corned beef. Ads sold cans as freedom. Freedom from cooking, shopping, spoilage, and even thinking. Just heat, serve, and pretend you made it from scratch. Somewhere along the line, the can became an anchor of normalcy. It fed astronauts. It fed doomsday preppers. It fed people on tight budgets and people with too much ravioli in their earthquake kits. It even got a nostalgic glow-up. Retro labels, collector's editions, and ironic tributes to Spam as both punchline and pantry MVP. And sure, we sometimes mock the can. It's not glamorous. It doesn't sparkle like a fresh farmer's market tomato. It doesn't have artisanal flair or Instagram appeal. But when a storm knocks out the power, when your fridge gives up, or when your paycheck's looking thin, there it is, loyal and unbothered, a quiet little cylinder of survival and spaghetti hoops. In fact, it's so normal now that we forget just how weird its journey has been. We forget that it started with a French confectioner sealing stew in bottles like he was bottling lightning. That the British followed up by turning dinner into a blunt force trauma instrument. That soldiers had to stab their meals open on the battlefield like they were reenacting Macbeth with a tin of lamb. That explorers died with their bellies full of poisoned beef. That the very idea of a can opener came decades after the thing it was meant to open. We forget that this unassuming kitchen object was once revolutionary. That it made global exploration feasible. That it fed armies. That it quietly changed the way humanity handles food, making it safer, more portable, and less dependent on geography or season. Today, cans sit in pantries across the planet, from Tokyo to Toronto, from Arctic research stations to suburban garages, quietly waiting their turn. They've been used as candle holders, musical instruments, and emergency camp stoves. They've survived wars, recessions, fashion trends, and every attempt by food snobs to cancel them. And they're still here, solid, sealed, slightly dusty. So the next time you open a can of beans or peaches or chili and hear that gentle swoosh pop, remember what it took to get there. The trial and error, the explosions, the lead poisoning, the can openerless decades of struggle, the generations of humans who fought their food and sometimes lost. Because the humble tin can isn't just food storage, it's history in aluminum form, a triumph of preservation, a symbol of survival. And most importantly, it no longer requires a bayonet. Before we had a machine that sucked up dirt with the grace of a caffeinated octopus, cleaning your home was a noisy, violent, and extremely personal affair. In the 18th and 19th centuries, people didn't so much clean their homes as wage war against filth, using brooms, brushes, and sheer righteous fury. Let's set the scene. Imagine a Victorian living room, heavy drapes, thick rugs, overstuffed upholstery, intricate carved furniture. It looks elegant, until you realize it's basically a dust museum. Everything in the room was made to trap dirt. If it had a surface, it had grime. If it had a cushion, it had secrets, and no one had a Dyson to save them. Back then, housework was basically CrossFit with more soot and less encouragement. There were no vacuums, no Swiffers, and certainly no cordless stick cleaners with turbo mode. You had to move the furniture, roll up the rugs, drag everything outside, and then commence the sacred ritual of beating the living hell out of it. This was usually done with a carpet beater, a long-handled woven wire tool that looked like a tennis racket designed by someone with a grudge against upholstery. Every spring, streets across Europe and America would echo with the sound of rugs getting slapped senseless, dust flying out like it owed rent money. The phrase spring cleaning wasn't just a seasonal tradition, it was a multi-day workout session that left everyone sore, breathless, and slightly ashamed of how much dirt had been living in their furniture rent-free. And this wasn't a casual process. Cleaning was moral, it was status. A clean house wasn't just about hygiene, it was about your soul. If you let dust accumulate, what did that say about your character, your family, your future? In the eyes of 19th century society, dirty curtains could basically ruin your daughter's marriage prospects. Domestic manuals, of which there were far too many, were relentless in their advice. One suggested that a woman must dust the parlor each morning before the sun rises, lest a guest arrive and find evidence of neglect. In other words, sleep is optional, but immaculate baseboards are non-negotiable. Even simple tasks were exercises in absurdity. Want to clean the floor? Grab a stiff broom. Get down on your hands and knees and scrub like you're trying to erase history. Dusting shelves? Best of luck reaching them with your feather duster and your Victorian corset crushing your ribcage. Windows? Prepare to spend your entire afternoon with vinegar, a rag, and a prayer. And let's talk about mattresses, which were stuffed with straw, wool, horsehair, or whatever fluff they could gather. Cleaning them involved hauling them out, shaking them, beating them, and then airing them in the sun like damp laundry. And no, they didn't smell like lavender. They smelled like time, sweat, and bad dreams. Of course, most of this wasn't done by the homeowners themselves, especially in wealthier households. It was left to servants, who often had to clean massive homes with nothing but rags and their own respiratory systems. There are documented accounts of maids coughing up blackened phlegm from years of inhaling dust clouds stirred up by endless scrubbing. To make matters worse, this was all happening in an age when coal fires were still the primary source of heating. Coal dust didn't politely sit in the fireplace, it invaded, it coated walls, settled on furniture, turned curtains grey, and made every room look like it had recently survived a volcanic eruption. You could clean a room top to bottom, only for it to get filthy again the moment someone lit a fire and said it's a bit chilly in here. Let's also not forget the delight that was chamber pots. Without indoor plumbing, these porcelain mood killers sat under beds or behind screens, waiting to be emptied, preferably by someone else. Cleaning floors wasn't just about sweeping crumbs. It also involved careful navigation through indoor biohazards. And don't even get started on curtains. Those thick, ornate Victorian drapes weren't just fashion statements. They were dust collectors with dreams of suffocating anyone with allergies. Cleaning them involved taking them down a gym-worthy task, beating them outside, and then rehanging them while dangling off a shaky ladder. In summary, cleaning before vacuums wasn't just hard, it was relentless, filthy, and oddly theatrical. It involved dragging half the contents of your house into the street, slapping everything like it insulted your ancestors, and pretending it was all perfectly normal. So when the vacuum cleaner finally came along, people didn't just adopt it for convenience, they fell in love with it, hard. Because after centuries of physically fighting dirt with nothing but elbow grease and passive aggression, humanity was more than ready for something that could suck the dirt up for them. But before we get to that glorious moment, we have to talk about the awkward teenage years of vacuum technology, when inventors tried to clean homes by blowing dirt around the room like confetti. If you thought the pre-vacuum era was bad, hold on to your feather duster, because the first mechanical cleaning machines weren't actually vacuums at all. They didn't suck, literally. In fact, they did the exact opposite. They blew. And not in the metaphorical "this product is terrible" kind of way, though. To be fair, they did that too. You see, in the late 1800s, inventors were brimming with enthusiasm, mechanical ambition, and a fundamental misunderstanding of airflow. The core idea was simple. If dust was bad and air was good, then why not blast more air into a room to get rid of the dust? Spoiler, the dust didn't leave, it just relocated. Usually into your eyes, your tea, and your soul. These machines were often powered by hand cranks, foot pedals, or if you were feeling fancy, small steam engines. They looked less like cleaning appliances, and more like rejected brass instruments or failed popcorn machines. Most had large bellows that puffed air out through nozzles, shooting a blast of wind directly onto whatever surface you were trying to clean. Now imagine this in practice. You point your newfangled air-blasting dust displacer at your dusty Victorian parlour rug. You turn the crank. A weak gust of air wheezes out, and the dust lifts, just enough to spread evenly across the room like a tragic confetti cannon. Congratulations, you've just redecorated in a palette of beige and disappointment. One such machine was ominously called the whirlwind. It sounded like a force of nature. In reality, it was about as useful as blowing through a straw to clean a barn. The whirlwind consisted of a wooden box on wheels, a large hand crank, and some tubing. Crank it up, and it would proudly huff a blast of air in the general direction of your mess. Whether or not it helped was anyone's guess. One user described it as impressive in sound, but lacking in conviction. Another device, charmingly called the pneumatic carpet renovator, promised to revolutionize domestic life. Its innovation? A large leather bellows and a mouthpiece that delivered a windstorm directly to the floor. It was so big it required 2 people, one to crank and one to aim, and occasionally a third to apologize to the guests covered in airborne lint. These devices were also marketed with terrifying optimism. Advertisements described them as scientific marvels and health-preserving dust removers. despite their tendency to turn living rooms into miniature dust storms. Victorian families used to slapping rugs and inhaling coal ash were likely unfazed, but servants were less enthusiastic. Cleaning had already been exhausting. Now it was exhausting and required dodging rogue dust clouds. Let's take a moment to appreciate the design logic at play here. These inventors saw the problem: dirt embedded in fabric, trapped in thick rugs, hiding in drapery, and thought, yes, what this needs is more wind. They created the reverse sneeze of appliances, as if a mechanical dragon was sneezing politely across your furniture and hoping the filth would just take the hint. And these weren't compact devices you could store in a closet. Oh no, early air-blasting machines were bulky, often the size of a side table or small cannon. They had gears, pumps, and tubing that snaked across rooms like mechanical intestines. And they were loud. Not just noisy gaslight rattle your teacup loud. Some models needed multiple people to operate them, which made cleaning a room feel like rehearsing for a steampunk theatre production. There were also safety concerns. One device used a belt-driven flywheel system that spun so fast it could, and occasionally did, detach mid-operation and become an airborne projectile, because nothing says clean living like dodging a flying gear while choking on airborne carpet fuzz. And yet, people kept buying them. Why? Because modernity had arrived, and these devices looked the part. The Industrial Revolution had already brought machines into factories, ships, and trains. Why not bring one into the home too? Even if it just rearranged your dirt, at least it made noise and had levers. That was progress. There's something oddly touching about these early attempts. They were absurd, yes. Ineffective, absolutely, but they were a sincere effort to make life easier, powered by the dream that one day, cleaning your home wouldn't require beating a rug like it owed you money. These awkward, huffing contraptions paved the way for what would eventually become a sleek, powerful, button-operated miracle that could handle dust without blowing it directly into your eyebrows. So the next time you fire up your modern vacuum and complain about it being a little heavy or slightly too loud, remember, it could be worse. You could be cranking a bellows the size of a fireplace while your living room fills with airborne Victorian despair. But things are about to get even louder, and significantly more equestrian, because in the next chapter, someone decides the best way to clean your house is to park a horse-drawn, gas-powered vacuum outside your window. By the dawn of the 20th century, inventors had finally come to a collective realization: blowing dirt around a room wasn't cleaning, it was chaos with extra lung damage. So naturally, the next logical step was to stop blowing and start sucking. But the transition wasn't subtle. In fact, it rolled in with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for military parades and circus elephants. Enter Hubert Cecil Booth, a British engineer who looked at the dust-choked messes of the Victorian world and thought, what if we just sucked all the dirt out of the house from the outside? In 1901, Booth built the world's first powered vacuum cleaner that actually sucked. And not just in principle, it literally vacuumed. It was called the Puffing Billy, and this beast of a machine was less of an appliance and more of a mobile industrial event. Picture this: a gas-powered engine mounted on a cart, so massive it required horses to pull it through the streets of London. It wasn't wheeled into your living room. It pulled up to your front door like a steampunk food truck from the soot dimension. How did it work? Well, it didn't go inside the house. That would have been madness. This thing was the size of a hearse and roared like a steam engine with bronchitis. Instead, Booth's team would snake long, flexible hoses through your windows, like your home was being invaded by mechanical pythons. The hoses would suck up dust, dirt, and a small amount of your dignity, and feed it all into a filter chamber on the wagon outside. The noise was remarkable. The Puffing Billy wasn't just loud, it was window rattling, bird scattering, tea spilling loud. If it started outside your house, your neighbors 3 doors down would know it. Booth had invented the world's first vacuum cleaner that could trigger gossip in a 3-block radius, and people loved it. Why? Because dirt removal had become more than a necessity. It was a public event. Hiring Booth's machine was a sign that you had money, taste, and absolutely no tolerance for dusty carpets. Socialites would invite friends over to watch the process, sometimes serving refreshments while the hoses wheezed and groaned like a tired dragon outside the window. Wealthy families in London would book Puffing Billy for grand occasions, balls, weddings, even funerals, because nothing honors the dead like polished upholstery. The louder it was, the more effective it seemed. It was less about hygiene and more about showing off your ability to wage war against grime with a machine that could double as a submarine engine. Even major institutions wanted in. Westminster Abbey, the British Navy, and several royal estates hired Booth and his machine to clean everything from ornate carpets to military barracks. If your space had dust, Booth would suck it up, preferably with an audience and a whiff of gasoline in the air. Of course, the logistics were a nightmare. First, you had to clear the street. This wasn't a discreet van. It needed room to park, space for the horses, and enough slack in the hoses to reach the farthest parts of the building. Then you had to ensure no one panicked when the engine kicked in. Booth's device didn't so much start as it announced itself like a brass band possessed by a lawnmower. But despite the theatricality, it worked. In fact, it worked incredibly well. The filters collected terrifying amounts of dirt, and Booth's team often showed clients the results, a pile of fuzz, soot, and shame that had been lurking in their carpets for years. One wealthy woman reportedly fainted upon seeing what came out of her drawing room rug. Another applauded, then offered Booth a drink. The reactions were mixed, but everyone agreed on one thing: the future of cleaning was here, and it was horse-powered, gas-fueled, and borderline offensive to your eardrums. Still, Booth had done something revolutionary. He had transformed the act of cleaning from a private, back-breaking ordeal into a mechanized public service with flair. Sure, it was loud. Sure, it blocked traffic. And yes, the horses occasionally relieved themselves mid-job, bonus cleaning required. But no one could argue with the results. Interestingly, Booth didn't stop there. He went on to develop smaller electric versions, designed for indoor use, though they never matched the sheer drama of the Puffing Billy. Because once you've vacuumed your home by summoning an engine that sounds like it eats coal and regrets, plugging something into a wall socket just feels tame. So the next time you hit a button and your sleek little cordless vacuum whirs quietly to life, just remember, in 1901, cleaning the house meant rolling up with a gas-powered beast, threading hoses through windows, and possibly alarming the local clergy. But the vacuum's transformation from public spectacle to household appliance was just beginning. Next up, how the vacuum went from horsepower to status symbol, and how it became the ultimate flex in early 20th century domestic design. If the last part was all about horsepower and public spectacle, this part is where things turn private, personal, and let's be honest, deeply competitive. Because once vacuums stopped requiring livestock and industrial ear protection, they did something even more powerful. They became status symbols. Loud, shiny, expensive, and sometimes barely functional, but absolutely necessary if you wanted to be taken seriously in your neighborhood. Welcome to the early 20th century, where the modern home was being reinvented, one appliance at a time. Electricity was starting to trickle into urban households. Mass production was ramping up, and the world was finally learning that a machine didn't need to be the size of a carriage to be taken seriously. In this glittering new consumer landscape, the vacuum cleaner wasn't just a tool, it was a lifestyle choice. Vacuum manufacturers saw an opportunity, and by opportunity we mean marketing goldmine. Enter companies like Hoover, Electrolux, and Kirby, who decided that cleaning wasn't just a necessity, it was a luxury, a mark of civilization, a glamorous act of modern efficiency. You weren't buying a vacuum cleaner, you were buying prestige. Owning one was the domestic equivalent of driving a new car or wearing a fur coat. And if you used it in view of the neighbors, even better. This shift was powered by one of the most powerful forces known to mankind: clever advertising. Magazines in the 1920s were filled with images of housewives looking positively thrilled to be vacuuming, dressed in heels, pearls, and freshly pressed aprons. Their smiles said, "I love my new vacuum," but their eyes said, "This cost a month's salary, and I will definitely be leaving the curtains open while I use it. One 1926 Hoover ad showed a woman gently pushing the machine across her pristine rug with the caption, "It beats as it sweeps, as it cleans." This wasn't just a tagline, it was a battle cry. A clean home meant moral virtue. A vacuum meant you were modern, hygienic, and not about to fall into ruin like those poor souls down the street still using a broom like peasants. And yes, early vacuums were often terrible, heavy, clunky, prone to overheating, and only slightly more efficient than a determined raccoon. But that wasn't the point. The real value was in being able to say, "We have a Hoover," much like a car that never left the driveway, or a decorative bowl you weren't allowed to touch. It was all about appearance. This was especially true in the rising middle class, where consumer culture was exploding like a motor overrun with fluff. Having a vacuum was proof that you were clean, cultured, and climbing the social ladder. And if your vacuum had chrome detailing, that ladder just got taller. The machines themselves got flashier too. Early Hoover models had wooden handles, polished metal finishes, and embroidered dust bags that looked more couture than utilitarian. Electrolux, on the other hand, leaned hard into European flair, producing sleek, tubular canisters that resembled something you might see in a Jules Verne submarine. One ad proudly described the design as tasteful enough to leave in any room. And then there was Kirby, the Rolls-Royce of vacuums. Kirby vacuums weren't just sold, they were demonstrated. Salesmen would show up at your house uninvited, clean a section of your carpet, dump out a horrifying pile of dirt, and then smile as if they'd just exorcised a demon from your hallway rug. Buying one was expensive. Not buying one meant you had secrets in your floor. This era also marks the beginning of something sinister, vacuum guilt. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to clean your home. It had to look like you cleaned your home with advanced technology and pride. Vacuums became part of the perfect housewife mythos, where women were encouraged to believe that their worth was directly proportional to the shine of their linoleum and the humming of their floor appliance. It was the domestic arms race in full swing. Who had the cleanest home, the quietest vacuum, the machine with the most attachments that no one actually used but kept in a drawer like sacred relics? And here's the twist. Despite all the glamour and expense, most people still barely knew how to use them. Instructions were vague, filters got clogged, belts snapped. If you sucked up something slightly too large, say a Lego or your child's sense of wonder, the entire machine would seize up like a lawnmower eating a brick. But again, who cared? It was shiny, it was loud, it was modern. So by the 1940s, vacuums had done something truly bizarre. They had transformed from a coal-powered street spectacle into a polished, electrified symbol of suburban dominance. The irony, of course, was that many of the people who owned them still hired someone else to do the actual cleaning. Because what mattered wasn't whether it cleaned your floor. What mattered was whether the neighbors saw you using it. By the mid-20th century, the vacuum cleaner had fully transformed from puffing public spectacle to glitzy domestic trophy. But there was still one thing missing. A human being who could walk into your house, charm you, humble you, and then vacuum your self-esteem into a branded dust bag. Enter the door-to-door vacuum salesman, the tuxedoed gladiator of suburban capitalism. These weren't your average salespeople, they were performers, trained not just in product specs, but in psychological warfare with a smile. And their battlefield? Your living room. It was an era when you could be minding your own business, baking, folding laundry, or hiding from your children, when a man in a crisp suit would knock, tip his hat, and say, "Madam, may I clean a portion of your carpet?" What he really meant was, "I am about to perform a passive-aggressive magic trick that ends in you writing a check." These salesmen didn't wait for you to ask. They showed up uninvited, armed with scripted charm, a large bag of props, and a vacuum cleaner that cost more than your couch. Often they worked for companies like Hoover, Kirby, or Electrolux, each one promising to eradicate every crumb, germ, and doubt you ever had about your cleaning habits. And they didn't just talk about the vacuum's power, they demonstrated it, right there, on your floor, sometimes without permission. One of their favorite tricks, dumping a spoonful of dirt onto your freshly vacuumed rug, then sucking it up while delivering lines like, "See, your vacuum missed this. Congratulations, you're now humiliated, angry, and 40% closer to a purchase." Another popular tactic, the coin trick. The salesman would vacuum up a handful of pennies to show how powerful the motor was. Of course, you were still left wondering if it could handle actual dust. But who cares? It just inhaled money. That's got to mean something. But the pièce de résistance was the black filter reveal. Salesmen would insert a fresh white filter pad into the machine, vacuum a section of your carpet, and then dramatically show the filthy, grey, shame-soaked square it had become. You'd stare in horror, wondering how much filth your children had been crawling on. Meanwhile, the salesman stood back like a stage magician, revealing the dismembered assistant was just fine. This wasn't just salesmanship. It was emotional theatre. And it worked. These guys were trained to overcome objections before you even voiced them. Yes, it's expensive, but can you really put a price on your children's health? Sure, it's loud, but that's the sound of progress and dust being obliterated. You don't clean much. Even better, this machine practically does the cleaning for you. Some were even instructed to create dirt if necessary. If your carpet was too clean for the drama, no problem. They carried pocket lint, powdered dirt, even ashes to sprinkle discreetly during their performance. Oh my, look at that. Your rug's hiding a secret. And then there were the staged accidents. Oops, just dropped this flower pot. Let me show you how the vacuum handles broken terracotta and shame. It was the cleaning equivalent of faking a limp before selling someone crutches. For the more resistant customers, there was always the escalation strategy. These salesmen often worked in pairs or backup shifts. If you said no to the first one, another would appear later. This one smoother, more persuasive, with a better smile and possibly a coupon. It was like a tag team wrestling match, but instead of body slams they used payment plans. And of course they always had limited time offers, which were neither limited nor timely. This deal is only available today, one might say, before returning next Tuesday with the same vacuum and a slightly larger sense of urgency. The most legendary of these vacuum crusaders came from Kirby, whose machines were so heavy they doubled as strength training. A full Kirby demo was a multi-act play. Heavy lifting, fine dust tests, upholstery attachments, even mattress demonstrations. They'd offer to clean your bed, your curtains, your stairs, your soul, if they thought it would help close the deal. And sometimes it worked too well. In the 1950s, vacuum salespeople were so prolific and so pushy that some towns passed ordinances to limit their visits. Homeowners grew wary of what was essentially unsolicited carpet therapy with a $300 invoice. But despite the occasional restraining order, the tactics stuck. Why? Because nothing sells like a surprise vacuum party and a little light shame. In the end, these salesmen did more than sell vacuums. They sold aspiration, a cleaner house, a better image, a sense of control in a messy world. It was a psychological trifecta of guilt, vanity, and polished hardwood floors. So the next time a vacuum ad appears online with a sleek design and a quiet motor, just remember, there was once a time when buying one meant letting a stranger into your home to critique your rug, sprinkle dirt on it, then charge you half a month's rent for the privilege. By the time World War II was over and the soldiers were coming home, America wasn't just rebuilding cities or boosting its economy, it was polishing linoleum floors with an enthusiasm only the 1950s could produce. And right at the center of this gleaming new domestic universe was one humble, humming, hose-toting hero, the vacuum cleaner. Before the war, vacuuming was already climbing the status ladder, but after the war, now it was a national duty. Because as the battlefield shifted from trenches to tract housing, the front line of American pride became the living room carpet, and the ideal soldier in this war of dust, the housewife. Armed, dangerous, and equipped with attachments for drapes. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1940s. The boys are home. The war factories are slowing down. Rosie the riveter has been gently encouraged to hang up her wrench and take up baking again. And in this carefully crafted fantasy of post-war paradise, the perfect home was spotless, shiny, and always stocked with canned ham and absolutely zero visible dust. That's when vacuum companies doubled down on marketing genius and mild propaganda. They didn't just sell machines, they sold morality. You weren't buying a tool, you were buying a better life. The message? A clean home was a happy home. A happy home was a patriotic home. And a patriotic home had a Hoover in the hallway closet. Advertisements from this era were jaw-dropping in their enthusiasm. One 1948 Electrolux ad proudly declared, "For the woman who wants the best and wants to be the best." Another Hoover campaign featured a woman in a crisp skirt, gazing lovingly at her vacuum like it had just returned from war with a purple heart and a fruitcake. The vacuum, in these ads, wasn't just a machine, it was her partner in domestic excellence, her ticket to neighborhood respect, her chrome-plated destiny. And yes, the messaging was aimed squarely at women. With the booming suburban sprawl, a new version of femininity was being constructed, one where women were expected to embrace the role of cheerful, efficient homemaker with the same gusto that wartime posters once used to rally troops. Only now, instead of rivets, they were conquering dust bunnies and moral decline. Of course, the vacuums themselves evolved to fit the dream. Gone were the clunky tanks and hulking hoses of the past. Mid-century models were sleeker, lighter, and styled like automobiles, because nothing says domestic bliss like a vacuum that looks like a Cadillac and sounds like a jet engine on decaf. You had shiny chrome finishes, futuristic curves, and even pastel colors to match your kitchen tiles. And if you were lucky, your vacuum came with a matching apron. Yes, really. And let's not forget the attachments. Oh, the glorious attachments. There were no fewer than a dozen accessories for every conceivable surface. Curtains, stairs, mattresses, upholstery, pets, theoretically, and that one unreachable corner behind the piano where old coins and secrets went to die. You might not have used all the attachments, but that was beside the point. You owned them. Like a domestic Batman, you had a gadget for everything. You were ready. Vacuum companies also leaned heavily into the idea of technological triumph. Ads would boast about atomic suction, turbo power, and hospital-grade filtration, as if these machines weren't cleaning your carpet, they were neutralizing pathogens in a Cold War bunker. The subtext was clear. America leads the world in innovation, and your living room should reflect that. But this era wasn't just about the machine, it was about what it represented. The spotless floor, the humming vacuum, the well-behaved children playing within sanitized reach, all these elements formed the cornerstone of the 1950s dream life, carefully polished and choreographed. To be a good wife now meant being a vacuum-powered domestic tactician, gliding from room to room like a gentle tornado of virtue and lemon-scented polish. Of course, not everyone found joy in this glittering fantasy. Beneath the glossy ads and television jingles, a quiet resentment was building. Some women were starting to ask, "Is this really what I fought for?" After working in munitions factories and managing ration lines, being reduced to a smiley appliance mascot felt less than revolutionary. But for now, the vacuum reigned supreme, as both symbol of progress and pressure. Still, there's no denying its cultural power. The vacuum had gone from an industrial oddity to a central figure in domestic mythology. It was both a machine and a mantra. Clean floors meant a clean conscience, and if your neighbors could hear the whirring through the open window, even better. So the next time you sigh while pushing your cordless Dyson across the rug in your pajamas, remember, there was a time when vacuuming was your civic duty, your moral compass, and your primary measure of personal worth. And all because someone in an ad agency decided that dust was the enemy of democracy. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, something very strange happened to the vacuum cleaner industry. Maybe it was post-war optimism. Maybe it was the space race. Maybe someone dropped too many marketing executives into a room with a gallon of chrome paint and a stack of science fiction comics. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Vacuums got weird, like really weird. Gone were the sensible, squared-off machines of early suburbia. Now, designers had one question on their minds. But what if this vacuum looked more like a space beetle, and their bosses, rather than laughing them out of the building, said, "Approved, put it in avocado green"? The 1950s kicked things off gently. Vacuums began to adopt sleek, aerodynamic shapes, clearly inspired by the same design language as Cadillacs and cocktail shakers. It was the age of streamlining, a word that basically meant pointy for no reason. Electrolux led the way with models that resembled miniature torpedoes, complete with tail fins, polished aluminium finishes, and the vague threat of liftoff. But by the 1960s, all bets were off. This was the jet age, baby. People were obsessed with flying cars, moon colonies, and the impending arrival of robot butlers who would vacuum your home while quoting Shakespeare. In that cultural soup, vacuums had no choice but to evolve or mutate. The result was a dazzling parade of bizarre and often completely impractical machines. Take the Hoover Constellation, for example. This was a vacuum cleaner that didn't roll on wheels. Oh no, it floated, using a downward air jet. The entire machine hovered slightly above the floor like a polite UFO. In theory, it glided effortlessly around your home. In practice, it bumped into furniture, sucked up your drapes, and occasionally hovered itself directly into your ankles. Then there was the Electrolux 310, which looked more like a prop from a 1960s sci-fi show than a household appliance. Shaped like a bullet with legs, it was both space-age and strangely bug-like, like something that would vacuum your living room and then lay eggs in the closet. Designers also tried their hand at color coordination. If your kitchen was turquoise and your linoleum was lemon yellow, well, your vacuum had to match. Out came machines in mint, coral, mustard, and every pastel shade in between. The home didn't just need to be clean, it needed to look like a candy store in zero gravity. And let's not forget the backpack vacuums. Yes, someone somewhere looked at a clunky 20-pound cleaning machine and said, "Strap it to me." These were aimed at commercial cleaners, but occasionally showed up in home catalogs, promoted with photos of smiling women looking suspiciously okay with wearing a jetpack of dust doom. The reality, they were heavy, hot, and made you look like you were training to clean the moon. But perhaps the most gloriously absurd designs came from the companies that believed form didn't just follow function, it dragged it into a lava lamp and left it there. There were vacuums shaped like round helmets, vacuums that looked like inflated typewriters, and even one model that resembled a tiny Dalek from Doctor Who, except it only exterminated pet hair. Still, despite their absurdity, or maybe because of it, these vacuums were a hit. Because in a world obsessed with modernity and future-forward living, having a space pod-shaped vacuum meant you were with it. You were stylish, you were daring, you were inhaling household dust with flair, but the party couldn't last forever. As the 1970s gave way to the 80s, all that space-age optimism started to dim. People began to notice that their floating vacuum didn't really float well, that their chrome-plated dust sucker left streaks, and that backpack vacuums were less space pilot and more sweaty regret. Consumers got tired of looking cool and started asking uncomfortable questions like, does it actually work? And why does my carpet smell like melted plastic? Eventually, the pendulum swung back. The market wanted functionality over flair, efficiency over moon boots. Design became more practical. Handles returned, wheels worked, colors calmed down. The golden age of vacuum absurdity slowly faded into infomercial reruns and thrift store sightings. But oh, what a golden age it was. It was a time when engineers had no leash, when aesthetics briefly outran logic, and when owning a vacuum that looked like a droid from Star Wars wasn't a joke, it was a flex. These machines weren't quiet, they weren't gentle, but they were unforgettable. So next time your modern vacuum glides silently across your living room, whispering promises of smart suction and eco-friendly modes, take a moment to appreciate the ghosts of vacuums past. They were bold, they were strange, and some of them were probably sentient. Once upon a time, the vacuum cleaner was a marvel. It hissed, it clanked, it came with chrome plating and societal pressure. It was a declaration that you had arrived socially, hygienically, and economically. Today, It's a quiet, frisbee-shaped robot that you accidentally kick while trying to make toast. Welcome to the strange final chapter in the saga of suction, from horsepower to housecat chariot. The humble vacuum has gone from elite home decor to the quietest roommate you've ever had. Let's start with the modern marvel itself, the robot vacuum. The most famous of these, the Roomba, launched in 2002 looking like a minimalist UFO and sounding like a sleepy bee. It promised an end to human suffering at least, the part of it that involved pushing a broom. Let the robot handle it, they said. Take a nap, they whispered. This is the future, they insisted. And for a moment it was. People marveled at their new cybernetic butlers. They named them. They watched them with awe as they wandered, beeped, bumped into chairs, and heroically tried to eat floor mats. 1 second your floor was dirty, the next, slightly less dirty in random patterns. Progress, but the Roomba and its many cousins marked something else too. The fall of the vacuum's prestige. No longer loud, proud, or shaped like Cold War machinery, today's vacuums are invisible by design. They're tucked away in closets. They whisper. They glide under the furniture like shy spirits of domestic maintenance. Back in the 1950s, vacuums were seen. They were giant, shiny exclamation points in your living room. Today, we trip over them, apologize, and post it on TikTok. The vacuum has gone from being a power statement to something you yell at for getting stuck under the couch for the 3rd time that morning. It's not just robot vacuums either. Even upright and canister models are now hyper-efficient, feather-light, and so quiet they could vacuum a room while you're on a Zoom call about how dusty your house is. Dyson made headlines by removing bags, then removing cords, then removing any trace of joy, replacing it all with clinically efficient suction and price tags that require a small loan. Somewhere along the way, the vacuum stopped being a symbol of modern marvel and became expected, just part of the furniture, like the toaster or the disappointing drawer of Tupperware lids. In fact, if the early 20th century vacuum was like a new car, today's vacuum is more like a utility bill, necessary, functional, and occasionally responsible for emotional outbursts. But while its status may have faded, its impact hasn't. The invention of the vacuum cleaner revolutionized hygiene, gender roles, interior design, engineering, and even robotics. It paved the way for home appliances to be both helpers and headaches. It created industries, marketing legends, and a legacy of suction-based arms races. And let's not pretend the modern vacuum hasn't tried to claw back some drama. Today's high-end vacuums come with apps, AI, smart maps, and the ability to text you from the laundry room. Some models can avoid pet messes with facial recognition level precision. Others automatically return to their charging base, like obedient little dust warriors reporting for duty. But even with all that technological wizardry, there's a quiet sadness. We no longer gather around to admire a new vacuum. No one puts on a nice dress to operate one. Nobody drops dirt on their own rug just to watch it get cleaned in awe. The vacuum has won the war on dust, but lost the public relations battle. It's a bit like watching an old rock star who now does insurance commercials. Sure, they still have the voice, but they used to have style, and yet, there's something poetic about the journey. The machine that once needed horses and gasoline now runs on Wi-Fi and cat memes. It started as a spectacle. It became a necessity, and now it's practically a member of the family. A clumsy, slightly confused cousin who cleans the floor and occasionally eats a sock, so the next time your robot vacuum bumps into the leg of a chair, pauses as if re-evaluating its life choices, then slowly pivots and drives into the same chair leg again. Remember this. You are witnessing the final evolution of a machine that once terrified the neighbors, sparkled in magazine ads and cost more than your refrigerator. Today it's silent, it's unassuming. It's not even particularly good at corners, but it walks, or rather rolls in the footsteps of giants. And sometimes, that's enough.